In 1960, Albert Camus died in a car accident at the age of 46. In his briefcase, recovered from the wreckage, was an unfinished manuscript exploring the question of origins, who we are and where we come from. In his pocket was an unused train ticket. He had chosen to travel by car instead. That choice killed him. This is the kind of death Camus wrote about throughout his career. Random, meaningless, absurd. A small decision with fatal consequences. No villain, no moral lesson, just physics, chance, and the indifference of the universe. But his ideas remain. Ideas about absurdity and rebellion, about living without hope but also without despair, about creating meaning in a universe that provides none. Albert Camus was born on November 7, 1913 in Mondovi, a small village in French Algeria. His father, Lucien Camus, was a cellar worker in a wine company. His mother, Catherine Sintes, was of Spanish origin and worked as a cleaning woman. The family lived in poverty, a condition that would mark Camus throughout his life and shape his understanding of human dignity. When Albert was less than a year old, his father was called to fight in World War I. Lucien Camus was wounded at the Battle of the Marne in October 1914 and died shortly after in a military hospital. Albert never knew his father. He would later write that he carried no memory of the man who gave him life, only a photograph and a few anecdotes told by relatives. After Lucien's death, Catherine moved with her two sons to Algiers, into her mother's apartment in the working-class district of Belcourt. The apartment was small, with no electricity and no running water. Catherine worked long hours cleaning houses to support the family. She was partially deaf and could barely read or write. She spoke very little, and Albert grew up in near silence at home. His grandmother ruled the household with strict discipline. She would beat the children with a whip made of bull sinew. Despite this harshness, or perhaps because of it, Albert learned early about suffering and injustice. He also learned about silent endurance from his mother, who never complained about her condition. The Belcourt neighborhood was a melting pot of French, Spanish, Italian, and Arab populations. Children played football in the streets. They swam in the Mediterranean Sea, which was just a short walk away. The sun, the sea, the physical joy of swimming and playing under the African sky. These elements became central to Camus' vision of life. He would later call himself a man of the sun, contrasting his Mediterranean sensibility with the darker, more pessimistic outlook of Northern European thinkers. At school, Albert showed exceptional intelligence. He was a good student, particularly strong in French composition. His teacher, Louis Germain, recognized the boy's potential. Germain saw that Albert was trapped by poverty, destined to leave school at 14 to work and support his family, as was common for children of his class. Germain took action. He visited Catherine Camus at home and convinced her to let Albert continue his studies. He prepared the boy for the scholarship examination that would allow him to attend the lycée, the secondary school that opened doors to higher education. Without Germain's intervention, there would have been no writer, no philosopher, no Albert Camus as we know him. Camus never forgot this debt. Years later, when he received the Nobel Prize in Literature, he wrote to Germain before anyone else. The letter expressed gratitude not just for academic help, but for showing him that a teacher could change a life through attention and care. At the lycée in Algiers, Camus encountered a world far removed from his home. Most of his classmates came from middle-class families. They had books, pocket money, leisure time. Camus had none of these things. He worked part-time jobs to contribute to household expenses. He wore the same clothes repeatedly. He never invited friends home because he was ashamed of the poverty they would see. Yet he excelled academically. He read voraciously, borrowing books from the school library. He discovered French literature, philosophy, and classical texts. He played football with passion and skill, becoming goalkeeper for the junior team of a local club. Football taught him about teamwork, strategy, and the importance of defending one's position. He would later say that everything he knew about morality and human obligations, he learned from football. In 1930, at age 17, Camus fell seriously ill. He began coughing blood. The diagnosis was tuberculosis, the great killer of the era. There was no cure, only rest and hope. He spent months in bed, unable to attend school or play football. The disease scarred his lungs permanently. It ended his dreams of becoming a professional athlete. It also brought him face to face with death at a young age. This encounter with mortality transformed his thinking. He realized that life was fragile, that death could come at any moment, and that time was precious. The experience planted the seeds of what would become his philosophy of the absurd, the recognition that human beings seek meaning in a universe that offers none, and that death makes all our efforts ultimately futile. But tuberculosis also gave him something else. It forced him to slow down, to think, to read more deeply. During his recovery, he discovered philosophers who would influence his work. Friedrich Nietzsche, who proclaimed the death of God, Arthur Schopenhauer, who saw life as suffering, and the ancient Greek Stoics, who taught acceptance of fate. Despite his illness, Camus completed his secondary education. In 1933, he enrolled at the University of Algiers to study philosophy. He supported himself through various jobs, working in the meteorological office, selling automobile parts, giving private lessons. He married Simone Hiet, a beautiful young woman with a morphine addiction. The marriage would not last. At university, Camus studied under Jean Grenier, a philosophy professor who became his mentor and lifelong friend. Grenier introduced him to contemporary philosophy and encouraged his writing. Under Grenier's guidance, Camus wrote his first serious essays and began to articulate his own philosophical vision. By his early 20s, Camus had experienced poverty, the loss of a father, life with a silent and disabled mother, serious illness, and the precariousness of existence. These experiences did not embitter him. Instead, they gave him a profound appreciation for simple pleasures: swimming, sunshine, friendship, love. They also gave him solidarity with the poor and the suffering. He would carry both the joy and the pain of his early years into everything he wrote. The sun and the sea, Mediterranean roots. The Mediterranean Sea shaped Albert Camus as much as any book or teacher. He grew up within walking distance of its shores. As a child, he swam almost daily during summer months. The beach at Algiers was where working-class families went for relief from the heat and the cramped conditions of their apartments. It was free, open to everyone, and offered a kind of equality that society denied. Camus described the experience of swimming as a form of communion with nature. The body moves through water, the sun burns on the skin, salt dries white on the arms and legs. In these moments, he felt fully alive, fully present. The Mediterranean taught him about physical joy, about the beauty of the world, about being in the moment rather than living for some future promise. This stands in contrast to much of European philosophy and religion, which tends to devalue the body and the physical world. Christianity speaks of the soul and heaven. Northern philosophers often emphasize suffering, sin, and the need to transcend the material world. Camus rejected these ideas. He insisted that this life, this world, this body are all we have, and they are enough. The light of North Africa also played a role in his thinking. Mediterranean light is harsh, bright, unforgiving. It illuminates everything, leaves no shadows. In this light, you see things clearly. There is no room for romantic illusions or comforting darkness. Camus brought this clarity to his philosophy. He looked at existence without blinking, without seeking refuge in hope or faith. The landscape itself influenced his aesthetics. Algeria offers stark contrasts: the blue sea against white buildings, the green of occasional palm trees against brown earth and rock, the intense colors under intense sun. This visual sharpness carried into his prose style. Camus wrote with precision and economy. His sentences are clean, declarative, visual. He shows rather than tells. There is also a particular rhythm to Mediterranean life that entered his work. Hot afternoons when everything stops, when people rest in the shade. Long evenings when the heat finally breaks and social life begins. A slower pace than industrial Northern Europe, less driven by productivity and progress. Camus valued this rhythm. He believed that modern life makes people forget how to live, how to simply be. The Mediterranean world taught him about tragedy in the Greek sense. The Greeks, who also lived under this sun and beside this sea, understood that life contains both joy and suffering, beauty and death. They did not try to explain away this contradiction. They accepted it and still celebrated life. Camus saw himself as continuing this tradition against the Christian European culture that surrounded him. In his essay, Summer in Algiers, Camus wrote about young people on the beach, beautiful and carefree, living for pleasure and the moment. He knew they would age, sicken, and die. But this knowledge did not diminish their beauty or the legitimacy of their happiness. Instead, it made both more precious. This is a Mediterranean wisdom, to embrace life fully while knowing it will end. The sea also represented freedom and possibility. From the Algiers waterfront, you could see ships heading to other lands. The Mediterranean connected North Africa to Europe, to the broader world. For a poor boy from Belcourt, this horizon suggested that life could be different, that he might escape the limitations of his birth. But Camus' relationship with Algeria was complicated. He loved the land, the physical place. Yet he also saw the injustice of colonial society. French settlers, including his own family, lived better than the Arab population. The French had the best land, the government positions, the opportunities. Arabs were second-class citizens in their own country. This contradiction troubled him throughout his life. The Mediterranean gave him a sensual pagan philosophy that celebrated earthly existence. But Algeria also showed him poverty, inequality, and oppression. These two aspects of his early environment pulled him in different directions. On one hand, he wanted to affirm life, to say yes to the world. On the other, he could not ignore suffering and injustice. His mature philosophy would attempt to hold both truths at once. When Camus moved to France in the 1940s, he often felt like an exile. Paris was grey, cold, closed in by buildings and clouds. He missed the light, the space, the sea. He would return to Algeria when he could, seeking to reconnect with the sources of his vitality, but he could never fully return. He was trapped between two worlds, the Mediterranean world of his youth and the European intellectual world of his career. His first novel, The Stranger, opens with the protagonist receiving news of his mother's death. He travels to her funeral under the hot Algerian sun. The sun beats down mercilessly throughout the first part of the book. Later, when the protagonist commits murder, he does so in a moment of confusion and disorientation caused by the overwhelming heat and light. The sun is almost a character in the novel, a force that shapes events. This use of setting reveals how deeply the physical environment of Algeria lived in Camus's imagination. He could not separate his thinking from the place that formed him. The Mediterranean was not just background. It was the ground of his philosophy, the foundation of his understanding of what it means to be human. Even his concept of the absurd has Mediterranean roots. The absurd arises from the confrontation between human desire for meaning and the universe's silence. But Camus insisted that recognizing the absurd should not lead to despair. Instead, like Sisyphus pushing his boulder under the Greek sun, we should imagine the absurd hero happy. This is a Mediterranean response, to acknowledge tragedy and still choose joy. The absurd hero, understanding Camus's core philosophy. The philosophy of Albert Camus begins with a simple observation. Human beings want life to make sense. We seek meaning, purpose, and rational explanations for why things happen. We want to believe that our lives matter, that our actions have significance, that the universe operates according to some comprehensible order. But when we look at the world honestly, Camus argues, we find no such meaning. The universe does not care about human concerns. It operates according to physical laws that have nothing to do with justice, goodness, or purpose. People suffer without deserving it. Good actions go unrewarded. Death comes to everyone regardless of their virtue or their crimes. This confrontation between human need for meaning and the universe's indifference is what Camus calls the absurd. The absurd is not that the world is irrational or chaotic. Rather, it is the gap between our rational minds and an indifferent universe. We are meaning-seeking creatures in a meaningless cosmos. Most people, according to Camus, cannot tolerate this situation. They seek escape from the absurd through various forms of evasion. Some turn to religion, which promises that life has divine purpose and that death is not the end. Others commit themselves to political ideologies that claim to reveal the meaning of history and the path to future redemption. Still others simply distract themselves with routine, entertainment, and the busyness of daily life. Camus rejects all these escapes. He insists on facing the absurd directly without consolation. This requires courage. It means accepting that we will die and be forgotten, that our achievements are ultimately futile, that the universe will not reward our goodness or punish our wickedness. It means giving up the hope that life will eventually make sense, But here is the key point. Recognizing the absurd does not lead Camus to despair or suicide. Instead, it leads to a kind of freedom and even happiness. Once you accept that life has no inherent meaning, you are free to create your own. Once you abandon hope for cosmic justice or eternal life, you can focus on living well in the present moment. The absurd hero is someone who fully acknowledges the absurd condition and yet chooses to live anyway. This person does not seek meaning from religion, ideology, or philosophy. Instead, they live with intensity, passion, and awareness. They squeeze as much experience as possible from the limited time available. They embrace life precisely because it is temporary and meaningless. Camus offers several examples of the absurd hero. The first is Don Juan, the legendary seducer. Don Juan loves many women but commits to none. He seeks quantity of experience rather than depth. Traditional morality condemns him as shallow and irresponsible. But Camus sees him as someone who understands that love cannot be eternal. So he chooses to love often and fully, accepting each affair for what it is without demanding more. The second example is the actor. An actor lives many lives through the roles he plays. He is a different person each night on stage. He knows these lives are illusions, yet he commits to them completely during the performance. The actor demonstrates how one can live passionately while acknowledging that all roles are temporary and ultimately empty. The third example is the conqueror, not a military conqueror seeking power, but someone who throws themselves into action and achievement without illusions. This person builds, creates, and accomplishes things while knowing that everything they create will eventually crumble to dust. They act not because their actions have cosmic significance, but because action itself gives meaning to life. All these figures share certain characteristics. They are lucid, fully aware of the absurd condition. They do not deceive themselves with false hopes. They are passionate, engaging deeply with life rather than withdrawing into passivity. They live in the present rather than sacrificing today for some imagined future. And a quantity of experience over quality. They want to live as much as possible in the time available. This philosophy challenges several assumptions common to Western thought. It rejects the idea that life must have purpose to be worth living. It denies that we need immortality or divine approval to justify our existence. It contradicts the notion that suffering is redemptive or that sacrifice for future generations gives meaning to individual lives. Camus's position also differs from nihilism. Nihilists conclude that since nothing matters, we might as well destroy everything or do nothing. Camus reaches the opposite conclusion. Since nothing is guaranteed to matter, we must make things matter through our choices and commitments. We create value through how we live, not by discovering it in some external source. The absurd philosophy is not pessimistic in Camus's view. Traditional philosophy and religion are pessimistic because they claim that earthly life is insufficient, that we need something more, heaven, historical progress, transcendent truth. Camus affirms that this life, this world, is enough. The problem is not that life is meaningless, but that we keep demanding it be something other than what it is. This helps explain one of Camus's most famous statements. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Sisyphus, in Greek mythology, was condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain for eternity. Each time he nears the top, the boulder rolls back down. He must descend and start again, forever. This seems like the ultimate symbol of futility and despair. But Camus argues that Sisyphus can be happy. In the moment when he walks back down the mountain, he is conscious and lucid. He knows his task is meaningless. He knows the gods have cursed him, and yet the boulder is his boulder, the task is his task. By fully accepting his fate without hope or illusion, Sisyphus achieves a kind of victory. The gods meant to torture him, but he has transcended their curse through acceptance and awareness. This applies to human life generally. We all push our boulders, work, relationships, projects that will not last. We age, we decline, we die. From a cosmic perspective, nothing we do matters, but we can choose to push our boulders consciously, fully engaged with the task, finding satisfaction in the effort itself rather than in some imagined final achievement. The absurd hero does not need the universe to validate their choices. They validate themselves through the intensity and authenticity of their commitment. This is both a burden and a liberation. It is a burden because we cannot blame God or fate or history for our condition. We must take full responsibility for how we live. But it is a liberation because we are free to choose our own path without waiting for permission or approval from any external authority. Camus' philosophy demands a lot from people. It requires intellectual honesty, emotional courage, and the ability to live without the comfort of certainty. Most people cannot or will not meet these demands. They prefer the consolations of religion or ideology to the harsh freedom of the absurd. Camus understands this but refuses to make concessions. He believes that facing reality, however difficult, is the only way to live authentically. The myth of Sisyphus, finding happiness in struggle. In 1942, Albert Camus published The Myth of Sisyphus, an essay that would become one of the foundational texts of existential philosophy. The essay opens with a striking declaration. There is only one really serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. Camus argues that once we recognize life has no inherent meaning, we must decide whether it is worth living at all. The question of suicide is not personal for Camus in this essay. He is not discussing psychological despair or mental illness. Rather, he is addressing the logical problem raised by the absurd. If life has no purpose, if we will die and be forgotten, if the universe does not care about human existence, then why continue? What rational justification can we offer for not ending our lives immediately? Many philosophers before Camus concluded that life is not worth living without transcendent meaning. They either embraced religion to provide that meaning or sank into pessimism and despair. Camus rejects both options. He insists that recognizing the meaninglessness of life does not justify suicide. Instead, it creates the conditions for authentic living. The essay is structured around the Greek myth of Sisyphus, whom Camus calls the absurd hero. The gods condemned Sisyphus to an eternity of futile labor. His crime, according to different versions of the myth, was either revealing divine secrets, chaining death itself, or simply being too clever and challenging the gods' authority. His punishment fits his nature. A man who lived by his wits must spend eternity in mindless, repetitive, physical labor. Camus focuses on a particular moment in Sisyphus's eternal cycle, the walk back down the mountain after the boulder has rolled to the bottom. This is the pause, the moment of consciousness between one effort and the next. During this descent, Sisyphus knows what awaits him. He has no illusions, no hope that this time will be different. He faces the absolute certainty of futility. This moment of lucid awareness is crucial. Sisyphus could be unconscious, laboring without thought like an animal. The gods would prefer this. Mindless suffering is more complete than conscious suffering. But Sisyphus remains aware. He knows his fate, accepts it, and returns to his task. This consciousness transforms his punishment into victory. Camus writes, "The lucidity that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. The torture is that Sisyphus knows his labor is pointless, but this knowledge also liberates him from the gods' power. They meant to crush him with futility, but he has accepted futility and made it his own. He pushes the boulder not because he hopes to succeed, but because pushing the boulder is what he does. The task itself becomes sufficient." This analysis applies directly to human existence. We are all Sisyphus. We work at jobs that will not matter in 100 years. We build relationships that will end in death or separation. We create things that will be destroyed or forgotten. From an objective viewpoint, everything we do is as futile as rolling a boulder up a mountain. The traditional response is to deny this futility by inventing purposes that transcend individual life. Religion says we labor for God's glory and eternal reward. Political ideology says we sacrifice for future generations or historical progress. But these are illusions, Camus argues. They are ways of avoiding the truth about our condition. The authentic response is to acknowledge the futility and live anyway. We do not need our actions to have cosmic significance. We do not need to believe in progress or redemption. We can find satisfaction in the struggle itself, in the conscious engagement with our tasks, in the full experience of being alive. Camus introduces the concept of revolt as central to the absurd condition. Revolt does not mean political revolution in this context. Rather, it means the refusal to accept or hope for anything beyond this life, combined with the determination to live as fully as possible within its limits. The absurd person revolts against the absurd by refusing either to accept false consolations or to surrender to despair. This revolt manifests in three attitudes: awareness, freedom, and passion. Awareness means maintaining lucid consciousness of the absurd without flinching or seeking escape. Freedom means recognizing that since nothing is predetermined or guaranteed, we are free to choose our path. passion means engaging intensely with life, seeking the maximum quantity and quality of experience in the time available. The essay examines several philosophical responses to the absurd that Camus considers inadequate. He critiques existentialist philosophers like Karl Jaspers and Søren Kierkegaard for making what he calls the leap, the decision to embrace religious faith despite its irrationality. These thinkers recognize the absurd but then leap beyond it into transcendence. Camus sees this as intellectual surrender, a failure of courage. He also critiques secular philosophies that attempt to find meaning in history or human progress. These substitute faith in the future for faith in God, but they are equally illusory. History has no direction. Humanity is not progressing toward anything. These beliefs simply transfer religious hope into a secular framework. The only honest position Camus maintains is to live without appeals to anything beyond immediate experience. This requires giving up hope, which might seem tragic, but Camus argues that hope is actually the enemy of authentic living. When we hope for something better in the future, heaven, utopia, personal fulfillment, we devalue the present. We live for tomorrow instead of today. Without hope, we are forced to focus on the present moment. We cannot defer happiness to some imagined future. We must find it now, in the midst of struggle, or not at all. This is why Camus concludes that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happiness is not something achieved after the struggle ends. It exists within the struggle itself, in the full engagement with our boulder. The essay's conclusion offers a vision of absurd happiness that challenges conventional understanding. Sisyphus returns to his boulder with a heavy yet measured step toward the torment of which he will never know the end. This could be interpreted as grim resignation, but Camus means something different. The heaviness is acceptance of reality. The measured step is conscious choice. Sisyphus is not dragged back to his task. He returns deliberately. "I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain," Camus writes. "One always finds one's burden again. We cannot escape our condition. We will always have our boulder, our task, our fate. But in fully accepting this, in making it our own choice rather than an imposed curse, we achieve a kind of freedom and even joy." This philosophy does not promise happiness in any conventional sense. It does not offer peace, satisfaction, or fulfillment. Instead, it offers something Camus values more: intensity, consciousness, and authenticity. The absurd person lives more vividly than those who comfort themselves with illusions. They experience both suffering and joy more deeply because they do not filter experience through false beliefs. The myth of Sisyphus had profound impact when published. It appeared during World War II when Europe faced genuine catastrophe and meaninglessness. Traditional values and institutions had collapsed. Millions died for causes that proved hollow. In this context, Camus' message resonated. Do not wait for life to make sense or for justice to prevail. Live fully now, in the midst of chaos, without illusions. The essay established Camus as a major philosophical voice. It articulated what many people felt but could not express: that life could be lived passionately and authentically without religious or ideological supports. This message would influence generations of readers who found in Sisyphus a model for their own struggles. The Stranger, a revolutionary novel. In 1942, the same year the myth of Sisyphus appeared, Albert Camus published his first novel, The Stranger. The book opens with one of the most famous lines in 20th century literature: "Mother died today," or maybe yesterday, I don't know. This sentence immediately establishes the protagonist's disturbing detachment from conventional emotions and social expectations. The narrator is Meursault, a young clerk living in Algiers. He receives a telegram informing him of his mother's death at the old people's home where he had placed her. He travels to the home for the funeral. During the vigil, he drinks coffee and smokes cigarettes. He does not cry. He does not want to see his mother's body. At the funeral the next day, he notices the heat, the brightness of the sun, and feels relief when the ceremony ends. This behavior shocks the other characters in the novel and would shock many readers. A son who does not weep at his mother's funeral appears heartless, perhaps monstrous. But Meursault is not cruel or unfeeling. He simply does not experience or express emotions in expected ways. He refuses to pretend feelings he does not have. He will not perform grief to satisfy social convention. The day after the funeral, Meursault goes swimming at the beach. He meets Marie, a former co-worker, and they begin a casual relationship. They go to the cinema to watch a comedy film. They spend the night together. When she asks if he loves her, he says he supposes not, but it does not really matter. When she asks if he will marry her, he says yes, though he does not particularly care one way or the other. Meursault lives entirely in the present moment. He notices physical sensations, the temperature of water, the taste of food, the texture of objects. He responds to immediate pleasures and discomforts, but he does not reflect on his life or plan for the future. He has no ambitions, no beliefs, no strong preferences about how things should be. His neighbor Raymond is a pimp who beats women. Raymond asks Meursault to write a letter to lure back a mistress whom Raymond wants to punish. Meursault agrees without moral judgment. He does not approve of Raymond's behavior, but he sees no reason to refuse a simple request. When Marie asks if he wants to marry her, and when Raymond asks for help with his revenge scheme, Meursault responds with the same indifference. The novel's central event occurs on a beach. Meursault accompanies Raymond and another friend to a beach house. They encounter two Arabs, one of whom is the brother of Raymond's mistress. There is tension, a confrontation. Later, Meursault walks alone on the beach in the intense midday heat. He encounters one of the Arabs again. The man has a knife. The sun beats down mercilessly. The light reflects off the sand and the blade of the knife. Meursault feels disoriented, almost hypnotized by the heat and glare. The Arab makes no threatening move. But Meursault, in a moment of confusion and discomfort, pulls out Raymond's gun and shoots the man once. Then, inexplicably, he fires 4 more shots into the motionless body. When asked later why he killed the Arab, Meursault cannot give a satisfactory explanation. He says it was because of the sun. This answer seems absurd, almost insulting. Courts and society demand comprehensible motives for murder: revenge, greed, passion, self-defense. But Meursault killed for no clear reason. The oppressive heat and light overwhelmed him. He pulled the trigger almost reflexively. The 4 additional shots came moments later, equally without thought. The second half of the novel takes place during Meursault's trial. The legal system attempts to understand his crime by examining his character and behavior. The prosecution focuses not on the murder itself, but on Meursault's conduct at his mother's funeral. He did not cry, he drank coffee and smoked. The next day, he went swimming and began a love affair. He watched a comedy film while his mother lay newly buried. The prosecutor argues that these facts reveal a man without moral feelings, a monster incapable of human emotion. A man who does not weep at his mother's funeral is capable of any crime. The murder of the Arab is presented as inevitable given Meursault's fundamental inhumanity. The prosecutor demands the death penalty, not primarily for killing the Arab, but for being the kind of person who would kill without comprehensible motive. Meursault's lawyer tries to defend him, but finds it difficult. Meursault will not help his own defense. He refuses to express remorse or explain his actions in ways the court can understand. He insists on telling the truth as he experienced it, even when this truth damages his case. He admits he did not love his mother in any conventional sense. He confirms he felt no hatred toward the Arab. He cannot pretend emotions he did not feel. The trial reveals the conflict between Meursault and society. Society demands that individuals conform to expected patterns of behavior and feeling. We must grieve in prescribed ways, love according to accepted forms, and act from comprehensible motives. Meursault rejects these demands. He lives according to his own immediate experience rather than social scripts. The jury finds him guilty. The judge sentences him to death by guillotine. In prison awaiting execution, Meursault is visited by a chaplain who wants him to repent and accept God. The chaplain offers the consolation of religious faith, the promise that death is not the end, that life has divine purpose, that suffering can be redeemed. Meursault explodes in anger. He seizes the chaplain by the collar and shouts that nothing the chaplain says matters. There is no God, no afterlife, no ultimate meaning. The chaplain's certainties are illusions. Everyone dies, and death makes all lives equal. The certainty of death is the only certainty that matters. This outburst exhausts Meursault, but also clarifies his vision. In his final hours, he achieves a kind of peace. He opens himself to the benign indifference of the universe. The world does not care about human concerns. The sky, full of stars, looks down with complete neutrality on human suffering and joy. This indifference, which might seem horrifying, brings Meursault comfort. He realizes he has been happy and still is happy. His life, lived without meaning or purpose, has been sufficient. He has experienced physical pleasures, the warmth of the sun, the coolness of water, the body of a woman. These experiences, though temporary and ultimately futile, were real. He does not need his life to add up to something greater. The experiences themselves were enough. The novel ends with Meursault hoping that on the day of his execution, there will be a large crowd of spectators who greet him with cries of hatred. This strange wish reflects his final understanding. He wants society to show its true face, to reveal that it condemns him not for any rational reason, but because he refuses to play by its rules. The crowd's hatred would confirm what he has always suspected, that social morality is arbitrary and often hostile to honesty. The Stranger shocked readers when it appeared. The protagonist's indifference to his mother's death violated one of society's most sacred taboos. Many readers found Meursault repellent, even evil, but others recognized in him something honest and even admirable, a refusal to lie about his feelings, to perform emotions he did not have, to accept meanings he did not believe. The novel illustrated the philosophy Camus developed in The Myth of Sisyphus. Meursault lives in the absurd condition without illusions. He does not believe in God, progress, or transcendent values. He experiences life directly, without filtering it through abstract beliefs. He accepts the indifference of the universe without complaint or false hope. The prose style Camus employed reinforced this philosophical stance. The sentences are short, declarative, factual. Meursault reports what happens without interpretation or emotional coloring. I did this, then I did that, the sun was hot, the coffee tasted bitter. This style, sometimes called white writing, strips away the layers of meaning and judgment that usually mediate between experience and expression. Critics debated whether Meursault should be read as a hero or an anti-hero. Some saw him as an honest man in a dishonest world, refusing to compromise with hypocrisy. Others saw him as dangerously amoral, lacking the capacity for genuine human connection. Camus himself said that Meursault refuses to lie, and this refusal condemns him in a society built on lies. The novel also raised questions about colonialism, though Camus did not emphasize this dimension. Meursault kills an Arab man who remains nameless throughout the novel. The French colonial court judges Meursault primarily for his behavior at his mother's funeral, not for killing an Arab. The victim's life and death matter less than the defendant's attitude toward his own mother. This reflects the hierarchy of colonial Algeria, where Arab lives counted for less than French lives. Some critics later faulted Camus for not addressing this issue more directly. The murdered Arab has no voice, no story, no humanity in the novel. He appears only as an obstacle, almost as part of the landscape. This absence reproduces the colonial erasure of Arab subjectivity. Camus, though sympathetic to Arab suffering in his journalism, did not fully recognize this problem in his fiction. Nevertheless, The Stranger remains one of the most influential novels of the 20th century. It has been translated into dozens of languages and read by millions. Its opening line is instantly recognizable. Its protagonist has become an archetype, the alienated individual who cannot or will not conform to social expectations. The novel spoke to a generation that had witnessed the collapse of traditional values during World War II. It articulated a modern sensibility, skeptical of authority, suspicious of grand narratives, focused on immediate experience rather than abstract principles. Meursault became a figure readers could identify with even if they did not approve of him. The book's exploration of guilt and innocence challenged conventional morality. Is Meursault guilty because he killed a man? Or is he innocent because he acted without malice and cannot help his own nature? Is society guilty for executing a man who simply refuses to lie? These questions have no easy answers, and the novel's power lies partly in leaving them unresolved. The Stranger established Camus as a major literary voice. Together with The Myth of Sisyphus, it defined his position in the existentialist movement, though he would later reject that label. The novel demonstrated that philosophical ideas could be embodied in fiction, that abstract concepts like the absurd could be made concrete through character and story. When World War II began in September 1939, Albert Camus was 25 years old. He was living in Algiers, working as a journalist and recovering from another bout of tuberculosis. His lung disease made him ineligible for military service. He could not fight, but he would find other ways to resist. In 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany. The French government signed an armistice and established a collaborationist regime in the town of Vichy. This regime governed the southern zone of France while Germany occupied the north. Algeria, as a French colony, fell under Vichy control. The authorities there enforced the same anti-Semitic laws that applied in France. Camus had been working for a newspaper in Algiers called Alger Républicain. The paper took progressive positions, criticizing colonialism and supporting Arab rights. Under Vichy, such positions became dangerous. The authorities shut down the paper. Camus lost his job. In 1940, he moved to Paris hoping to find work and escape the provincial constraints of Algeria. Paris, under German occupation, was a city transformed. Soldiers in Wehrmacht uniforms patrolled the streets, swastika flags hung from public buildings, Jews were required to wear yellow stars, people disappeared into prisons or were deported to camps. An atmosphere of fear and suspicion pervaded daily life. Camus found work as a reader for the publishing house Gallimard. This position allowed him to survive financially while working on his writing. He completed The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus during this period. But he also became involved in more dangerous activities. In 1943, Camus joined the resistance network called Combat. The French resistance consisted of various groups opposed to German occupation and the Vichy regime. Some groups engaged in armed struggle, sabotaging German installations and assassinating collaborators. Others focused on gathering intelligence or helping people escape Nazi persecution. Combat specialized in publishing and distributing an underground newspaper, also called Combat. This might seem minor compared to armed resistance, but it was crucial and dangerous work. The newspaper provided information the censored press would not report. It maintained morale among the occupied population. It demonstrated that resistance continued despite German power. Producing an underground newspaper required meticulous secrecy. The group had to obtain paper, which was rationed. They needed printing equipment, which was monitored. They had to write articles, print copies, and distribute them without detection. Anyone caught participating faced torture, deportation, or execution. Camus started as a contributor, writing articles under pseudonyms. He argued for resistance based on moral principles rather than nationalism or ideology. He insisted that the fight against Nazism was fundamentally about human dignity and freedom. These were not merely French values, but universal ones that applied to all people. By 1944, Camus had become the editor of Combat. This position made him a key figure in intellectual resistance to occupation. His editorials articulated the moral case against collaboration and passive acceptance of tyranny. He wrote clearly and forcefully, never descending into propaganda or lies. The work was exhausting and stressful. Camus and his colleagues lived with constant fear of arrest. The Gestapo was efficient at infiltrating resistance networks. One betrayal could lead to dozens of arrests. Many of Camus' comrades were captured, tortured, and killed. He attended meetings knowing each one might be his last as a free man. His tuberculosis worsened under the strain. He had attacks of fever and coughing that left him weak, but he continued working. The newspaper had to appear regularly. If publication stopped, readers would assume the network had been destroyed, damaging morale. The articles Camus wrote during this period reflect his philosophical positions while engaging with immediate political realities. He opposed the German occupation but also criticized aspects of pre-war French society that had enabled fascism's rise. He argued that after liberation, France would need moral and political renewal, not simply a return to previous conditions. He rejected hatred as a basis for resistance. Many resistance fighters were motivated by hatred of Germans, desire for revenge, or nationalist fervor. Camus insisted on fighting without hatred. The enemy was not the German people, but the Nazi ideology and the violence it unleashed. After victory, the goal should be justice and reconciliation, not retribution. This position put him at odds with some comrades who saw the conflict in more absolute terms. They wanted punishment for collaborators and harsh treatment of Germany after the war. Camus urged restraint and adherence to principles even in dealing with enemies. He believed that using Nazi methods to fight Nazis would betray the values resistance claimed to defend. In August 1944, Allied forces liberated Paris. Camus and Combat emerged from underground. The newspaper continued as a legal publication with Camus as editor-in-chief. It became one of the most influential papers in liberated France, known for its ethical stance and literary quality. The liberation brought new dilemmas. France immediately began prosecuting people accused of collaboration. Trials were held, and many collaborators were executed. Public anger demanded vengeance against those who had worked with the occupiers. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public humiliations. Camus found himself in a difficult position. He supported prosecuting serious collaborators who had sent people to death camps or directly served the Nazi regime. But he opposed the summary executions and mob justice that characterized some purges. He called for legal procedures, proportionate punishment, and eventual clemency. This stance brought criticism. Some accused him of being soft on traitors. Others questioned his commitment to justice for victims. Camus replied that maintaining ethical standards in the treatment of enemies was precisely what distinguished democracies from totalitarian regimes. If France simply mirrored Nazi brutality, the war would have been fought for nothing. He wrote editorials calling for the death penalty for certain collaborators while also advocating mercy for others. This position seems contradictory, and Camus later came to reject capital punishment entirely. But in 1944, he believed that some crimes demanded the ultimate penalty while others deserved forgiveness. The experience of occupation and resistance profoundly shaped Camus's thinking. He had witnessed what human beings could do to each other when ideology and power combined. He had seen ordinary people commit extraordinary acts of courage and others collapse into collaboration. He had lived with fear and uncertainty for years. This experience informed his next major work, The Plague, which he began writing during the war. Though the novel is set in Algeria and concerns a disease epidemic, it is clearly an allegory for the Nazi occupation. The plague that isolates and kills represents the evil that descended on Europe. The characters who fight the disease represent different forms of resistance. Camus's wartime journalism demonstrated that philosophical principles could guide political action. He showed that one could resist tyranny without becoming tyrannical, fight evil without embracing hatred, and maintain moral standards even in extreme circumstances. These were not easy positions to hold, especially when colleagues and friends were dying. After the war, Camus remained editor of Combat for several years. But he gradually became disillusioned with political journalism. The idealism of the resistance gave way to the compromises and cynicism of normal politics. The hope for moral renewal after liberation dissipated as old patterns reasserted themselves. He also grew tired of the constant pressure and controversy. Every editorial brought attacks from one side or another. Political disputes consumed energy he wanted to devote to literature and philosophy. In 1947, he resigned as editor and returned to full-time writing. The war years had taken a toll on his health and spirit. He had lived through years of danger, stress, and moral complexity. He had made decisions about life and death, about who deserved punishment and who deserved mercy. These were not abstract philosophical questions, but immediate practical ones with real consequences. Yet these years also confirmed his core beliefs. Human beings could maintain their dignity even under oppression. Ordinary people could resist tyranny through simple acts of honesty and courage. Evil could be fought without becoming evil oneself. These convictions, forged during the war, would guide his work for the rest of his life. The Plague, metaphor for evil and human solidarity. In 1947, Albert Camus published The Plague, a novel set in the Algerian city of Oran. The book tells the story of an epidemic that strikes the city, isolating its inhabitants and killing thousands. On the surface, it is a realistic narrative about disease and quarantine. But everyone who read it understood that Camus was writing about something else, the Nazi occupation of France, and the broader question of how people respond to evil. The novel opens with rats emerging from sewers and dying in the streets. The city authorities ignore this warning sign until people begin dying of a mysterious illness. A doctor named Bernard Rieu diagnoses bubonic plague, though officials are reluctant to accept this conclusion. Admitting plague would require declaring quarantine, which would disrupt commerce and cause panic. Eventually, the deaths force action. The authorities seal off Oran. No one can enter or leave. Inside the city, residents must confront the plague and their own mortality. Some flee into denial or distraction. Others exploit the situation for profit, but a few, including Dr. Rieu, organize voluntary sanitation teams to fight the disease. The plague serves as a metaphor for any evil that descends on a community without warning or justification. It could represent Nazi occupation, but also war, totalitarianism, or the general cruelty that humans inflict on each other. The disease is impersonal. It strikes without regard for virtue or vice. The good die alongside the wicked. Children suffer as much as adults. This randomness reflects Camus' view of evil in the world. Bad things happen to people who do not deserve them. The universe does not punish the guilty or protect the innocent. Suffering is distributed according to no moral logic. This is the absurd condition applied to ethics. We want justice, but reality does not provide it. Dr. Roux becomes the novel's moral center. He is not a heroic figure. He does not particularly enjoy his work. He simply does what needs doing because he is a doctor and people are sick. When asked why he fights the plague so tirelessly, he says it is a matter of common decency. He cannot watch people die without trying to help. This attitude embodies Camus's ethics. We cannot cure the absurd or eliminate evil from the world, but we can respond to suffering with practical action. We can reduce pain even if we cannot end it. We can maintain our humanity even when the universe shows no humanity. Other characters represent different responses to catastrophe. Father Panelou is a Jesuit priest who initially interprets the plague as divine punishment for sin. He preaches that the citizens of Oran brought this suffering on themselves through wickedness. They should accept their fate and repent. But when Panelou witnesses a child dying in agony, his certainty collapses. He can no longer believe in a God who would torture an innocent child. This reflects Camus's rejection of religious explanations for suffering. Panelou wants to believe that pain has meaning, that it serves God's purposes. But the child's death admits no such interpretation. The suffering is simply horrible, without redemptive value or divine plan. Panelou continues to believe in God, but his faith becomes darker, more uncertain, stripped of comfortable certainties. Tarot is a character who keeps a chronicle of events during the plague. He comes from a family of magistrates and judges. His father sentenced people to death as part of his profession. Tarot recalls attending an execution as a young man and being horrified by the bureaucratic, casual way the state killed a human being. Since then, he has devoted himself to never, under any circumstances, accepting or causing death. Tarot represents the position of absolute pacifism and refusal to kill. He volunteers for the sanitation teams because fighting the plague is a way to save lives without destroying them. He and Roux become friends despite their different philosophies. Roux is pragmatic, doing what he can without demanding moral perfection from himself. Tarot seeks to be a saint without God, to achieve moral purity through his own efforts. The novel explores whether such sainthood is possible. Can human beings maintain absolute innocence? Tarot eventually dies of the plague himself, despite his efforts to fight it. His death suggests that no one escapes the general human condition. We are all implicated in suffering and death, regardless of our intentions. Raymond Rambert is a journalist trapped in Oran when the quarantine begins. His first concern is escaping to rejoin his wife in Paris. He arranges an illegal exit through smugglers, but at the last moment, he decides to stay and join the sanitation teams. He realizes he would be ashamed to be happy while others suffer. He chooses solidarity with the trapped citizens over personal escape. This choice represents the ethic Camus advocates. We are all in this together. Abandoning others to save ourselves is understandable but ultimately wrong. True humanity requires accepting shared fate and shared responsibility. Rambert gains nothing material from staying, but he preserves his self-respect and sense of connection to others. The novel's narrator, whose identity is revealed only at the end as Dr. Roux himself, maintains a chronicle of events. He insists on recording what happened accurately, without exaggeration or dramatization. He wants future readers to understand what the plague was like, how people behaved, what was lost. This reflects Camus's own experience in the resistance, documenting Nazi crimes and French responses. The narrator understands that memory is crucial. If people forget what happened, if they let the horror fade into abstraction, they become vulnerable to its return. The chronicle is a form of resistance to historical amnesia. The plague eventually subsides as mysteriously as it arrived. The authorities open the city gates. Separated lovers reunite. Commerce resumes, people celebrate liberation. But Dr. Roux warns against excessive optimism. The plague bacillus never dies, he notes. It can wait for decades in furniture or clothing. One day it will send its rats to die in a happy city, and the cycle will begin again. This ending is both hopeful and ominous. Human beings can survive catastrophe and rebuild. Community and solidarity can persist through horror, but evil is not permanently defeated. It lies dormant, waiting to return. Vigilance is necessary. We cannot assume that because we survived one plague, we are safe from the next. The novel was immediately recognized as one of the most important books of the post-war period. Readers understood that Camus was addressing the experience of occupation and the broader question of how to live ethically in an absurd world. The plague is the absurd made concrete, meaningless suffering that strikes without reason. But the novel also offered a response to the suffering. We cannot prevent or explain evil, but we can resist it through practical action and human solidarity. We can maintain our decency even when the universe shows no concern for decency. This is not a triumphant message, but it is not despairing either. It suggests that human beings have resources within themselves to confront catastrophe. Critics noted the novel's deliberate lack of dramatic intensity. Camus writes in a calm, almost clinical style. There are no heroic speeches or melodramatic scenes. People simply do their work, day after day, fighting the plague through routine and persistence. This flatness is intentional. Heroism, in Camus's vision, is not dramatic. It consists of ordinary people doing difficult things without expectation of reward or recognition. The novel also explores the theme of separation. The quarantine cuts people off from loved ones outside the city. Throughout the epidemic, people suffer not only from disease, but from forced isolation. They cannot see those they love. They cannot even know if those people still live. This separation becomes a torture as acute as physical illness. This theme resonated with readers who had lived through war and occupation, when families were torn apart by deportation, imprisonment, or military service. Camus captures the specific pain of not knowing, of being unable to help those you love, of being reduced to waiting and hoping with no assurance. The Plague established Camus as not just a novelist, but a moral voice for his generation. The book offered guidance on how to live through catastrophe without losing one's humanity. It acknowledged the absurdity of suffering while insisting that this absurdity does not excuse indifference or passivity. We must fight the plague, knowing we cannot eliminate it permanently because fighting is what makes us human. Paris, fame, and the burden of success. In the years following World War II, Albert Camus became one of the most celebrated intellectuals in France. He was not yet 40 years old, but his novels and essays had made him famous throughout Europe and beyond. He was handsome, charismatic, and brilliant. He moved in the most prestigious literary circles of Paris. Yet this success brought complications that would trouble him for the rest of his life. Paris, in the late 1940s, was the intellectual capital of the Western world. Writers, philosophers, and artists gathered in cafes to debate politics, literature, and ideas. The Café de Flore and Les Deux Magots in Saint-Germain-des-Prés became legendary meeting places. Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and their circle dominated these scenes. Camus was part of this world, though he never felt entirely comfortable in it. He had come from poverty in Algeria. His mother could barely read. He had worked manual jobs to support himself through school. Now he found himself among bourgeois intellectuals who had never known real hardship. They discussed workers and revolution in abstract terms. Camus had lived the working class life they romanticized. This created a distance between him and his peers. The literary establishment embraced him nonetheless. His novels were bestsellers. His plays were performed in major theaters. Publishers competed for his work. He was invited to give lectures and attend conferences across Europe. This recognition provided financial security he had never known. It also created pressure to maintain his position and produce new work that would meet expectations. Camus' relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre initially appeared to be a deep friendship. The two men admired each other's work and shared some philosophical ground. Both rejected religious faith and traditional morality. Both emphasized human freedom and responsibility. They collaborated on projects and defended each other in public. But significant differences existed beneath the surface. Sartre was a systematic philosopher who built elaborate theoretical frameworks. Camus was a novelist and essayist who distrusted systems and abstractions. Sartre believed political engagement required aligning with historical forces, specifically communism despite its flaws. Camus insisted on maintaining moral principles regardless of political consequences. Sartre came from a comfortable family and attended elite schools. He had financial support throughout his education. Camus had fought for everything he achieved. These different backgrounds shaped their perspectives on politics and revolution. Sartre could afford to be theoretical. Camus had seen real poverty and knew that abstract ideas had concrete human costs. The Paris intellectual scene demanded constant political engagement. Writers were expected to take positions on every major issue. Neutrality was considered cowardice. Silence was interpreted as complicity. Camus found this atmosphere exhausting. He believed writers should maintain some distance from politics to preserve their independence and clarity. His tuberculosis continued to plague him. He suffered recurring episodes that left him weak and bedridden for weeks. The Paris climate, damp and gray, aggravated his condition. He missed the sun and warmth of Algeria. He often felt like an exile in the city that celebrated him. Fame also complicated his personal life. Camus had married Francine Faure in 1940. She was a pianist and mathematician from Oran. They had twin children, Catherine and Jean, born in 1945. Francine was loyal, intelligent, and devoted to the family. But Camus could not remain faithful to her. He had numerous affairs throughout his marriage. Some were brief encounters, others were prolonged relationships with actresses, students, and women from literary circles. His most serious affair was with Maria Casares, a Spanish actress of remarkable beauty and talent. Their relationship lasted years and caused both of them considerable pain. Camus wanted the stability of marriage and family. He loved his children and appreciated Francine's steadiness. But he also craved the excitement of new romantic connections. He was drawn to passionate women who understood his work and shared his artistic sensibility. He could not reconcile these conflicting desires. This pattern of behavior hurt people who loved him. Francine suffered from his infidelities. She developed depression and at one point attempted suicide. The women he became involved with also suffered, knowing he would not leave his family for them. Camus felt guilty about the pain he caused, but seemed unable to change his behavior. His personal contradictions extended to his public role. He advocated solidarity and community in his writing. He praised simple virtues like loyalty and honesty, yet in his private life, he repeatedly betrayed trust and deceived those closest to him. This gap between his philosophy and his behavior troubled him, though he never resolved it. The success of his work also created artistic pressure. After The Stranger and The Plague, readers expected another masterpiece. Publishers wanted books that would sell. Critics analyzed everything he wrote, looking for signs of development or decline. This scrutiny made writing more difficult. Camus worked slowly and carefully. He revised extensively, seeking exactly the right word and rhythm. He could not produce quickly to meet demand. The pressure to maintain his reputation while working at his own pace created anxiety. He sometimes feared that his best work was behind him, that he had exhausted his creative resources. The theatrical world provided some relief from these pressures. Camus loved theater and worked as a director and adapter of plays. He directed productions of works by Dostoevsky, Faulkner, and Calderon. This work allowed him to be creative without the isolation of writing alone. It also connected him to actors and the physical, embodied nature of performance. He adapted several novels for the stage, including his own The Stranger. He wrote original plays exploring philosophical themes through dramatic action. His play Caligula examined absolute power and nihilism through the story of the mad Roman emperor. The Misunderstanding dealt with fate, recognition, and the failure of human communication. These theatrical projects were artistically satisfying but also exhausting. Rehearsals consumed weeks. He had to manage actors' egos and technical problems. Critics judged the productions harshly if they failed to meet expectations. Yet Camus kept returning to theater because it allowed him to work with others rather than alone. His celebrity status brought unwanted attention. People approached him in cafes wanting to discuss philosophy or ask for help with their own writing. Journalists requested interviews. Photographers wanted pictures. He could not walk through Paris anonymously. This constant attention invaded his privacy and disrupted his concentration. He began to retreat from public life when possible. He spent time in the countryside, seeking quiet places to work. He became more selective about which invitations to accept and which events to attend. But he could not entirely escape the burden of being a famous intellectual. The political atmosphere of the late 1940s and early 1950s became increasingly polarized. The Cold War divided Europe and the world into opposing camps. The Communist Soviet Union and the capitalist United States competed for influence. Intellectuals were pressured to choose sides. Many French intellectuals, including Sartre, aligned with communism despite evidence of Stalin's crimes. They argued that the Soviet Union, whatever its flaws, represented the future and the hope of the working class. They minimized reports of labor camps, political purges, and totalitarian control. Any criticism of the Soviet Union was dismissed as serving American imperialism. Camus could not accept this logic. He had witnessed totalitarianism under Nazi occupation. He recognized similar patterns in Stalin's regime. He insisted that ends do not justify means, that no political goal warrants mass murder and oppression. This position put him at odds with much of the Parisian left. He was accused of being a reactionary, a defender of capitalism, an agent of American interests. These accusations stung because Camus considered himself a man of the left. He supported workers' rights, opposed colonialism, and advocated social justice. But he refused to support totalitarianism regardless of its professed goals. This political isolation added to his sense of being out of place in Paris. He had achieved everything a writer could want: fame, financial success, critical recognition. Yet he felt increasingly alienated from the intellectual community that had embraced him. He missed Algeria, where life seemed simpler and more authentic. He longed for physical connection to place rather than the abstract world of ideas and arguments. His health continued to deteriorate. The stress of fame, political controversy, and personal complications aggravated his tuberculosis. He spent months at a time in sanatoriums trying to recover enough strength to work. These periods of isolation were both frustrating and necessary. They removed him from the pressures of Paris, but also from the creative stimulation he needed. During these years, Camus began to question the direction of his work and life. He had articulated a philosophy of the absurd and written novels that embodied this philosophy. But he felt he had not yet said everything he needed to say. He began thinking about moving beyond the absurd to explore questions of revolt, justice, and how to live ethically in an unjust world. This transition would lead to his next major philosophical work, The Rebel, and to the final bitter break with Sartre that would reshape the French intellectual landscape. But in the late 1940s, Camus stood at the height of his fame, troubled by success and searching for a way forward. The Rebel, Politics, Violence, and Revolution. In 1951, Albert Camus published The Rebel, a lengthy philosophical essay examining the nature of revolt and revolution. The book attempted to answer a question that had troubled him throughout the 1940s. If life is absurd and has no inherent meaning, what justifies political action? More specifically, does the recognition of absurdity permit or even require revolutionary violence? Camus begins by distinguishing between revolt and revolution. Revolt is the individual's refusal to accept injustice and oppression. It is a spontaneous response to witnessing or experiencing cruelty. The slave who suddenly says no to his master is revolting. This act affirms human dignity and declares that some things are intolerable. Revolution, by contrast, is organized political action aimed at transforming society according to an ideological blueprint. Revolutionaries claim to know the laws of history and the path to human liberation. They justify present violence and suffering as necessary steps toward future redemption. They sacrifice individuals to the collective goal. This distinction is central to Camus's argument. He accepts and even celebrates revolt as an essential human response to oppression. But he rejects revolution as it had developed in the modern world, particularly communist revolution. He argues that revolution betrays the original impulse of revolt by creating new forms of tyranny. The book traces the history of revolt from ancient times through the modern era. Camus examines figures like Spartacus, who led a slave rebellion in Rome, and the Russian nihilists who assassinated Tsarist officials in the 19th century. He analyzes philosophers who justified political violence, including Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. His central argument is that modern revolution has become nihilistic. Revolutionaries claim that history has a direction and meaning that justifies any action in service of progress. They murder in the name of future happiness. They enslave people today to create freedom tomorrow. This logic, Camus insists, leads inevitably to totalitarianism. He focuses particularly on the Soviet Union under Stalin. The communist regime had killed millions through forced collectivization, manufactured famines, and political purges. Labor camps held countless prisoners who had committed no real crime. The state controlled every aspect of life through terror and propaganda. Yet many Western intellectuals defended this system as a necessary stage in humanity's progress toward communism. Camus calls this position obscene. No future utopia justifies present mass murder. No abstract historical law outweighs the reality of individual human suffering. The communist revolution had betrayed its original promise of liberation by creating a system as oppressive as the Tsarist regime it replaced. This critique extended to intellectual supporters of communism in France and elsewhere. Camus argues that these intellectuals had become complicit in totalitarian crimes by rationalizing or ignoring them. Their theoretical sophistication allowed them to explain away evidence of horror. They valued their ideological system more than human lives. The book proposes an alternative to revolutionary violence. Camus advocates what he calls moderation or limits. We should resist injustice without claiming to possess absolute truth about how society should be organized. We should fight oppression without becoming oppressors ourselves. We should maintain moral limits even in pursuing political goals. This position rejects the idea that history has meaning or direction. There is no promised land toward which we are progressing. There is no scientific law guaranteeing that revolution will create a just society. We act not to fulfill historical destiny, but to reduce suffering and increase freedom in the present. Camus acknowledges that this approach seems less heroic than revolutionary commitment. The moderate does not offer certainty or promise total transformation. The moderate simply tries to improve conditions while avoiding creating new evils. This sounds unheroic, even cowardly, compared to the revolutionary's total dedication. But Camus insists that true courage lies in accepting limits. It is easier to believe in an ideology that justifies any action than to act responsibly without ideological certainty. It is more difficult to fight injustice while remaining just than to fight without moral constraints. The moderate path requires more wisdom and discipline than revolutionary fanaticism. The book discusses specific examples of revolutions that betrayed their original ideals. The French Revolution began with declarations of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It ended with the guillotine and Napoleon's empire. The Russian Revolution promised workers' power and ended with Stalin's dictatorship. These patterns suggested that revolution itself contains seeds of totalitarianism. Camus examines why this happens. Revolutionaries begin by recognizing genuine injustice. They correctly identify real oppression and suffering, but in their desire to eliminate injustice completely and forever, they become absolutist. They cannot tolerate disagreement or compromise. They see anyone who questions their methods as an enemy of humanity. This absolutism leads revolutionaries to divide the world into good and evil, progressive and reactionary, historical and counter-revolutionary. There is no middle ground, no partial truth in opposing views. You are either with the revolution or against it. This binary thinking justifies destroying anyone who stands in the way. The book argues that this mentality reproduces religious thinking in secular form. Instead of God's will, revolutionaries invoke historical necessity. Instead of heaven, they promise a future communist society. Instead of heretics, they identify class enemies and counter-revolutionaries. The structure of thought remains religious, even as the content becomes atheist. Camus proposes that authentic revolt must remain faithful to its origins. The rebel initially says no because he recognizes the value of human life and dignity. If he then kills in the name of his cause, he contradicts his own starting point. He can only remain consistent by limiting his means, by refusing to treat other human beings as expendable. This led Camus to reject capital punishment, which he had previously accepted in certain cases. He came to see that taking any human life, even that of a criminal or political enemy, contradicts the affirmation of human value that motivates revolt in the first place. If we kill our enemies, we become like them. The book's publication caused immediate controversy. Communist intellectuals attacked it viciously. They accused Camus of betraying the working class, serving capitalism, and providing intellectual ammunition for Cold War anti-communism. They portrayed him as naive at best and reactionary at worst. Existentialist philosophers associated with Sartre criticized the book's historical analysis and philosophical arguments. They found his concept of limits vague and his rejection of revolutionary violence unpragmatic. They argued that in situations of extreme oppression, violence might be necessary and justified. Many readers found the book difficult. It was long, dense, and covered extensive historical and philosophical ground. Unlike The Stranger or The Plague, it did not tell a story or create vivid characters. It demanded sustained attention and prior knowledge of European intellectual history. Yet the book articulated a position that resonated with many who were disillusioned with communism but still committed to social justice. It provided philosophical grounds for opposing both capitalism and communism, for seeking a third way between Cold War extremes. It suggested that one could be politically engaged without embracing totalitarian movements. Camus dedicated significant attention to the question of whether political murder could ever be justified. He discusses a group of Russian revolutionaries in the early 20th century who assassinated Grand Duke Sergei in 1905. One of the conspirators, Ivan Kalyaev, had a chance to throw his bomb when the Duke was riding in a carriage with his young niece and nephew. Kalyaev refused because killing children was unacceptable even to achieve his political goal. Later, after successfully assassinating the Duke when he was alone, Kalyaev was captured, tried, and executed. He accepted his death as the price for taking a life, even an oppressor's life. Camus presents Kalyaev as a model of ethical revolt, someone willing to kill for his cause but only within limits, and willing to pay with his own life for doing so. This contrasts sharply with modern terrorists and revolutionaries who kill indiscriminately and feel no personal responsibility for their actions. They hide behind historical necessity or revolutionary justice. They do not accept that taking life requires sacrificing something of yourself. This refusal to accept personal moral cost is what transforms revolt into nihilistic violence. The book concludes by arguing that the human condition is defined by tension between the desire for unity and the reality of division. We want to overcome all contradictions and conflicts. We want a perfect society where justice fully reigns. But this desire is another form of the search for absolute meaning that Camus has already rejected as illusory. Instead, we must accept permanent tension and imperfection. We must work to reduce injustice without expecting to eliminate it completely. We must oppose tyranny without becoming tyrants. We must maintain our humanity in an inhuman world. This is the path of authentic revolt as opposed to totalitarian revolution. The rebel represented Camus' attempt to develop a political philosophy consistent with his recognition of the absurd. If life has no transcendent meaning, political action cannot appeal to historical laws or ultimate purposes. It can only be justified by immediate human values, reducing suffering, protecting dignity, increasing freedom. This limited but real foundation suffices for ethical political engagement. The Great Break, Camus versus Sartre. The publication of The Rebel in 1951 set in motion a series of events that would lead to one of the most famous intellectual breaks of the 20th century. The friendship between Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, which had defined Parisian intellectual life for years, ended in bitterness and public recrimination. The rupture reflected not just personal conflict, but fundamental philosophical and political disagreements. Initially, Sartre's response to The Rebel was relatively mild. He had reservations about the book's arguments, but did not attack it publicly. The serious conflict began when Les Temps Modernes, the influential journal Sartre edited, published a lengthy review of the book written by Francis Jeanson, one of Sartre's associates. Jeanson's review was devastating. It accused Camus of abandoning progressive politics for comfortable moralizing. It claimed the book's rejection of revolutionary violence served reactionary interests by undermining the struggle against capitalism. It suggested Camus had lost touch with working-class reality and retreated into abstract humanism that changed nothing. The review also attacked Camus personally. It implied he had become bourgeois, more concerned with his literary reputation than with justice. It suggested his Algerian background made him defensive about colonialism. It portrayed him as someone who had once been genuinely radical but had been corrupted by success and fame. Camus was deeply hurt and angered. He wrote a response addressed to Monsieur le Directeur, formerly to Sartre as the journal's editor, though the letter attacked Jeanson's arguments. The tone was defensive and bitter. Camus accused Jeanson of misrepresenting his positions. He defended his commitment to justice and workers' rights. He suggested that Sartre had allowed the attack because he secretly agreed with it. The letter revealed Camus' sensitivity to criticism and his feeling of being misunderstood by the Parisian intellectual establishment. He had come from poverty. He had fought fascism in the resistance. He had consistently opposed oppression and injustice. Yet he was being portrayed as a reactionary by people who had never experienced the hardships he had known. Sartre responded with his own open letter, published in the same journal. His reply was even harsher than Jeanson's review. He accused Camus of moral superiority and philosophical confusion. He defended revolutionary violence as sometimes necessary in situations of extreme oppression. He suggested Camus' position was naively idealistic and politically ineffective. More painfully, Sartre attacked aspects of Camus' personality and career. He implied that Camus' success had gone to his head, that fame had made him thin-skinned and unwilling to accept criticism. He suggested Camus wanted to be admired and could not tolerate disagreement. The letter was devastating in its combination of philosophical critique and personal attack. The exchange became public spectacle. The French intellectual world took sides. Some supported Camus' moral stance against totalitarianism. Others backed Sartre's argument that revolutionary change sometimes required methods that violated liberal principles. The debate extended beyond the immediate participants to encompass broader questions about political commitment and intellectual responsibility. At stake were competing visions of what intellectuals should do. Sartre believed writers and philosophers must align themselves with progressive historical forces, particularly the working class and its vanguard, the Communist Party. Even if communism had flaws, it represented humanity's best hope for liberation. Criticizing it from the outside served reactionary interests. Camus rejected this logic entirely. He insisted intellectuals must maintain independence from political movements and parties. Their role was to witness, to speak truth, to refuse complicity with injustice regardless of which side committed it. They should not subordinate moral judgment to political calculation or historical speculation. These positions reflected different philosophical foundations. Sartre's existentialism emphasized freedom and commitment. Human beings create meaning through choosing and acting. Since history has no inherent direction, we give it direction through our choices. Aligning with revolutionary movements is one way to exercise authentic freedom and work toward human liberation. Camus' philosophy of the absurd led to different conclusions. Since life has no inherent meaning, we cannot appeal to historical laws or ultimate purposes. We can only act based on immediate human values, reducing suffering, respecting dignity, protecting life. No future goal justifies present crimes because we have no guarantee the future will vindicate our actions. The personal dimension of the break was equally important. Camus felt betrayed by someone he had considered a friend. Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir had been part of his social circle. They had collaborated on projects and defended each other publicly. The harshness of Sartre's attack seemed to violate their friendship. Sartre, for his part, may have resented Camus' fame and moral authority. Camus had become the face of French literature internationally. His novels were more widely read than Sartre's philosophical works. He was better looking, more charismatic, more appealing to general readers. Sartre was the superior philosopher, but Camus was the better writer and public figure. There were also class tensions beneath the surface. Sartre came from a comfortable bourgeois family. He attended elite schools and never worried about money. Camus had fought his way up from poverty through talent and determination. This difference in background shaped their perspectives on revolution and violence. For Sartre, political commitment was largely theoretical. He supported communism intellectually, but lived comfortably in Paris, enjoying fame and financial security. He could afford to be revolutionary in theory because he faced no personal risk from the positions he took. For Camus, politics was more concrete. He had experienced poverty, disease, war, and occupation. He knew what suffering felt like. His rejection of revolutionary violence came from lived experience, not abstract philosophy. He could not casually accept that millions might need to die for a theoretical future benefit. After the exchange of letters, Camus and Sartre never spoke again. They occasionally encountered each other at public events, but did not interact. Their mutual friends had to choose sides or navigate carefully between them. The rupture divided the Parisian intellectual community for years. The break took a toll on Camus personally. He valued friendship and loyalty highly. Losing Sartre's friendship hurt more than the philosophical disagreement. He felt isolated from the intellectual community that had embraced him. He became more withdrawn, more skeptical of engagement with Parisian literary life. Some observers believe the rupture was inevitable given their different backgrounds, temperaments, and philosophical commitments. Others see it as a tragic waste, a personal falling out that overshadowed legitimate philosophical differences. Either way, it marked a turning point in post-war French intellectual history. The debate also reflected larger forces shaping the 1950s. The Cold War pressured intellectuals to choose sides. Neutrality seemed impossible. The revelation of Stalin's crimes, particularly after Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, vindicated many of Camus's warnings about Soviet totalitarianism, but by then, the personal damage was done. Simone de Beauvoir later wrote about the conflict in her memoirs. She acknowledged that Sartre's response had been harsh, perhaps too harsh, but she defended the substance of his critique. She believed Camus had indeed become politically conservative, that his philosophy offered no practical guidance for fighting oppression. Camus never wrote extensively about the break. He mentioned it briefly in private correspondence, expressing hurt and disappointment. He continued to develop his political philosophy in other works, but the bitterness of this controversy may have contributed to his gradual withdrawal from public intellectual debate. The rupture between Camus and Sartre represents more than a personal falling out between two famous writers. It embodied fundamental tensions in 20th century political thought: reform versus revolution, morality versus effectiveness, individual conscience versus collective action, immediate ethics versus historical vision. These tensions remain unresolved, making the debate between Camus and Sartre still relevant decades later. Algeria's tragedy between two worlds. Throughout his life, Albert Camus remained deeply connected to Algeria, the land of his birth. But this connection became increasingly painful as Algeria descended into a brutal war for independence from France. The conflict forced Camus into an impossible position between his love for Algeria and his commitment to justice, between his French identity and his solidarity with the oppressed. Algeria had been under French control since 1830. Unlike other French colonies, it was considered an integral part of France itself, divided into departments like any French region. But this legal fiction masked profound inequality. The European settler population, known as Pieds Noirs, enjoyed full citizenship rights and controlled the economy and government. The Arab and Berber populations, though vastly more numerous, were treated as second-class inhabitants of their own land. Camus had witnessed this inequality throughout his childhood. He grew up among the poor, including many Arabs. He saw how French colonialism created prosperity for some while condemning others to poverty and exclusion. As a young journalist in the 1930s, he wrote articles exposing the miserable conditions of Arab peasants in the Kabylia region. He advocated reforms to address these injustices. But Camus never supported full independence for Algeria. He believed that French and Arab populations had lived together for generations and were now intertwined. He hoped for a solution that would grant equality to Arabs while maintaining some form of association with France. This position satisfied no one and left him vulnerable to attacks from both sides. The war began in November 1954 with coordinated attacks by the National Liberation Front, known by its French initials FLN. The organization demanded complete independence and was willing to use violence to achieve it. The French government responded with military force, sending hundreds of thousands of troops to suppress the rebellion. The conflict quickly became savage. The FLN attacked French military targets, but also civilians, including Europeans and Arabs who cooperated with French authorities. French forces used torture systematically to extract information from suspected rebels. Both sides committed atrocities. Villages were burned, prisoners were executed, terror became a weapon employed by all parties. Camus was horrified by the violence on both sides. He understood the grievances that drove Arabs to rebellion. He had documented these injustices himself, but he could not accept the deliberate killing of civilians, including women and children. He also could not accept French torture and collective punishment of Arab populations. His mother and other family members still lived in Algeria. They were working-class people who had no responsibility for colonial policy. They simply lived where they had always lived, speaking French, working ordinary jobs, raising their families. The FLN did not distinguish between wealthy colonists and poor Pieds Noirs. All Europeans were targets. This personal dimension made the conflict unbearable for Camus. When he spoke about Algeria, he was not discussing an abstract political question. He was talking about a place where his mother lived, where his childhood friends still resided, where the streets and beaches he loved were now scenes of violence and death. In 1956, Camus traveled to Algiers to make a public appeal for a civilian truce. He called on both sides to agree not to target non-combatants. He argued that whatever the political outcome, deliberately killing innocent people was wrong and counterproductive. The speech took courage. Armed men from both sides could have attacked him. The audience included people who hated him for not taking their side. The appeal failed. Neither the French military nor the FLN had any interest in limiting their methods. Each side believed that restraint would hand advantage to the enemy. The violence continued and intensified. Camus' attempt at mediation only exposed his political isolation. He was attacked from all directions. The French right accused him of being soft on terrorism, of not fully supporting France's efforts to maintain sovereignty. The left accused him of defending colonialism, of valuing European lives more than Arab lives. Algerian nationalists saw him as a defender of French domination. No one accepted his position that the conflict was a tragedy where both sides bore responsibility. In a famous exchange during a lecture in Stockholm, a young Algerian student confronted Camus. The student accused him of remaining silent about French atrocities while Arabs were being tortured and killed. Camus responded with words that would haunt him. "I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice." This statement has been endlessly analyzed and criticized. Some see it as admirable honesty, Camus acknowledging that abstract principles cannot entirely override particular attachments and loyalties. Others see it as a moral failure, placing family and tribal identity above universal justice. Still others note that the statement was more complicated in context than the famous quotation suggests. What Camus meant was that he could not support actions that would endanger his mother and other innocent civilians, even in service of a just cause like Algerian independence. He was not saying his mother mattered more than justice generally. He was saying that justice itself requires protecting innocent people, including his mother, from political violence. But the statement revealed Camus' dilemma. He could not be purely objective about Algeria. He had particular attachments to place, to people, to memories that shaped his political position. These attachments conflicted with his commitment to justice and his sympathy for Arab suffering. He was trapped between loyalties that could not be reconciled. As the war continued, Camus withdrew from public debate about Algeria. He stopped giving interviews on the subject. He declined invitations to take positions or sign petitions. This silence brought more criticism. People demanded that a figure of his moral authority speak out. His refusal to do so was interpreted as cowardice or complicity. But Camus recognized that anything he said would be used by one side or the other to justify violence. If he condemned French torture, the right would accuse him of betraying France. If he condemned FLN terrorism, the left would accuse him of defending colonialism. He could not win, and his words would not stop the killing. Silence seemed the only honest option. This position was psychologically costly. Camus had built his reputation on moral clarity and willingness to take unpopular stands. Now, on the issue closest to his heart, he could say nothing. The conflict paralyzed him intellectually and emotionally. He could not write about Algeria without betraying some part of himself. The historical context made the situation even more painful. Decolonization was sweeping across Africa and Asia. Former European empires were collapsing. Independence movements were succeeding elsewhere. The historical tide was clearly running against colonialism. Camus understood this, but understanding did not resolve his personal agony. He also recognized the complexity that public debate oversimplified. Algeria was not simply a case of European colonizers oppressing indigenous people. The Pied Noir population included many poor people whose families had lived in Algeria for generations. They spoke French, not Arabic. They knew no other home. Where would they go if Algeria became independent? The Arab population itself was not monolithic. Some genuinely desired independence and supported the FLN. Others feared what independence would bring. Some wanted reform within a French framework. Some simply wanted to survive and keep their families safe. The violence made moderate positions impossible. Everyone was forced to choose sides. Camus also worried about what would follow independence. He did not believe the FLN would create a democratic, pluralistic society. He feared that independence would lead to dictatorship, the expulsion of Europeans, and continued suffering for ordinary Algerians. These fears would prove largely accurate, but expressing them during the war seemed like defending colonialism. The tragedy was that Camus' position contained real wisdom. The war did not need to be as brutal as it became. Civilian lives could have been spared. A negotiated settlement granting equality and eventual autonomy might have prevented years of horror. But such nuanced positions had no place in a conflict that had become absolute. His personal anguish deepened as the violence escalated. Friends died on both sides. His beloved city of Algiers became a war zone. The beaches where he had swum as a child were patrolled by armed soldiers. The neighborhoods where he grew up were scenes of bombings and gun battles. The Algeria of his memory was being destroyed. Camus' final position on Algeria was essentially tragic. He saw no good outcome, only degrees of catastrophe. He hoped for a ceasefire and negotiation, but had no illusion that either side would compromise. He wanted justice for Arabs, but feared the violence that pursuing justice was unleashing. He loved Algeria, but could not defend its continued colonization. This paralysis contrasted sharply with his earlier moral clarity on other issues. During World War II, he had known that fascism must be fought without compromise. In the debate about communism, he had clearly articulated why totalitarianism was unacceptable. But on Algeria, the issue that mattered most personally, he could find no clear position. Some biographers believe the Algerian conflict contributed to Camus' death. Not directly, but through the psychological toll it took. He was exhausted, depressed, unable to write with his former energy and conviction. The joy and vitality that had characterized his early work disappeared. He had become trapped in an impossible situation that drained his creative resources. Algeria achieved independence in 1962, 2 years after Camus' death. The Pied Noir population, nearly 1 million people, fled to France as refugees. Most left everything behind, becoming exiles in a country many had never seen. The Algerian government established authoritarian rule that continues in modified form today. The optimism of liberation gave way to dictatorship, civil war, and economic stagnation. Whether different policies during the colonial period or the war could have prevented this outcome remains debated. Camus believed that earlier reforms and genuine equality might have created a different path, but by the 1950s, the positions had hardened beyond compromise. The accumulated injustices of colonialism had created hatreds that only violence could express. The Algerian tragedy illustrates the limits of moral philosophy when confronted with particular attachments and historical complexity. Camus, who had written so brilliantly about the absurd and about ethical revolt, found himself without answers when the conflict struck at his deepest identity. The man who advocated lucidity and facing reality without illusions could not bear to face the full reality of Algeria's situation: love, women, and impossible relationships. Albert Camus' personal life was marked by contradictions that paralleled the tensions in his philosophy. He wrote about solidarity and commitment. He praised loyalty and honesty as fundamental virtues. Yet in his romantic relationships, he was serially unfaithful, causing pain to the women he claimed to love. This gap between his public philosophy and private behavior troubled him but never led to lasting change. Camus married twice. His first marriage in 1934 to Simone He ended in divorce after 2 years. Simone was beautiful and troubled, addicted to morphine. Camus was 21, still a student, himself recovering from tuberculosis. The relationship was passionate but chaotic. Simone's addiction made stable life impossible. Camus discovered she was having affairs, including with his friends. The marriage collapsed, leaving him hurt and disillusioned. His second marriage was to Francine Faure, a pianist and mathematician from Oran. They married in 1940, just as World War II was disrupting Europe. Francine was intelligent, stable, and devoted. She came from a middle-class family and brought a sense of order to Camus' life. They had twin children, Catherine and Jean, born in 1945. Francine provided the domestic stability Camus needed. She managed the household, raised the children, and supported his work. She tolerated his moods, his health crises, and the demands of his career. She asked little for herself. In many ways, she was the ideal partner for a writer who needed freedom and quiet to work. But Camus could not remain faithful. Within years of the marriage, he began having affairs. Some were brief encounters during travels, others were sustained relationships that lasted months or years. He pursued actresses, students, women from literary circles, anyone who attracted him. The pattern was compulsive, almost self-destructive. His most significant affair was with Maria Casares, a Spanish actress of remarkable beauty and talent. She had fled Spain with her family during the Civil War. Her father had been a Republican government minister. She brought to the relationship a passionate intensity that matched Camus' own nature. They understood each other as artists and exiles. The relationship with Maria began in 1944 and continued with interruptions for the rest of Camus' life. They worked together in theater. He directed plays in which she performed. Their artistic collaboration deepened their romantic connection. Maria accepted that he would not leave his family, but the acceptance cost her. She wanted more than he could give. Camus told Maria he loved her. He told Francine he loved her. Both statements were apparently sincere. He seemed capable of loving multiple women simultaneously, though in different ways. Francine represented stability, family, and the continuity of daily life. Maria represented passion, art, and the intensity of romantic connection. He needed both, but could not honestly maintain both. The deception required to sustain this double life tormented him. He lied about where he was going and whom he was seeing. He invented excuses for absences. He managed complex logistics to keep the relationship separate. This dishonesty violated his philosophical commitment to authenticity and truth-telling. Francine suffered most from these arrangements. She knew about the affairs, at least in general terms. The knowledge caused her profound distress. She developed severe depression that required hospitalization. At one point, she attempted suicide, yet she stayed in the marriage, bound by love, by the children, and by lack of better options. Friends and colleagues noticed Camus' behavior. Some were shocked by the contradiction between his public persona and private conduct. Others saw it as typical of male writers and intellectuals of the era, when such behavior was more tolerated than it would be later. Few confronted him directly about it. Camus himself seemed aware of the contradiction without being able to resolve it. In his notebooks, he wrote about the difficulty of remaining faithful, the pull of new romantic possibilities, the desire for both freedom and commitment. He analyzed his behavior but did not change it. Understanding did not lead to different choices. Part of the pattern may have stemmed from his childhood experiences. His mother was emotionally unavailable, silent and distant. His grandmother ruled the household harshly. He grew up without the secure maternal love that shapes healthy attachment. This early deprivation may have left him constantly seeking what he never received, unable to feel satisfied with what he had. His tuberculosis also played a role. The disease reminded him constantly of mortality. Life was short and uncertain. Each woman he encountered represented life, vitality, the possibility of connection before death. In the face of mortality, faithfulness seemed like a surrender, a denial of life's possibilities. There was also an element of narcissism. Camus was handsome and famous. Women were attracted to him. This attention fed his ego and made restraint difficult. He could pursue affairs because opportunities presented themselves constantly. The ease of conquest may have made fidelity seem unnecessary, yet he genuinely cared for the women he became involved with. He was not simply using them. He formed real emotional connections. He worried about their well-being. When relationships ended, he felt loss. But these sincere feelings did not prevent him from pursuing new connections while maintaining existing ones. The women he loved most shared certain characteristics. They were intelligent, strong-willed, and artistic. He was not attracted to passive or conventional women. He wanted partners who challenged him intellectually and matched his intensity. Francine, Maria, and others he became involved with were all formidable individuals in their own right. His relationships with women also shaped his creative work. Female characters in his novels and plays reflect the women he knew. The girlfriend in The Stranger, the wife in The Plague, the women in his plays, all carry traces of real women from his life. He transformed personal experience into fiction, though not always in ways the actual women would have recognized or appreciated. Camus's behavior towards women has been reassessed by recent scholars. By contemporary standards, his conduct appears manipulative and harmful. He took what he wanted from relationships while avoiding full responsibility for the pain he caused. He prioritized his needs and desires over the well-being of the women who loved him. Some defenders argue that judging historical figures by current moral standards is unfair. Marital infidelity was more common and more tolerated among French intellectuals in the mid-20th century. Open marriages and complex arrangements were not unusual in these circles. Camus was behaving consistently with the norms of his social world. But this defense is weak. Camus himself did not have an open marriage. He deceived Francine rather than honestly negotiating different terms. And the women he became involved with generally wanted more commitment than he offered. He was not simply operating within accepted social codes, but actively causing suffering through his choices. His inability to reconcile his need for romantic variety with his desire for stable family life represents a failure of the integration he advocated philosophically. He wrote about living authentically, confronting reality honestly, accepting responsibility for one's choices. But in this crucial area of life, he avoided authentic confrontation with his own behavior and its consequences. The pattern continued until his death. In his final years, he was involved with multiple women simultaneously. He maintained his relationship with Maria while living with Francine and pursuing other affairs. The emotional and logistical complexity of these arrangements consumed enormous energy that might have gone into his work. Some biographers speculate about what Camus might have become if he had lived longer and resolved these personal contradictions. Would he have achieved greater peace and produced more mature work? Or was the tension itself somehow necessary to his creativity? These questions cannot be answered, but they point to the gap between the philosophy Camus articulated and the life he actually lived. The Fall, Descent into Self-Examination. In 1956, Albert Camus published The Fall, his last completed novel. The book marked a significant departure from his earlier fiction. It was darker, more cynical, and more self-critical than anything he had written before. The narrator is unreliable, manipulative, and morally compromised. The tone is bitter and ironic. The philosophical message is ambiguous and troubling. The novel takes the form of a monologue delivered by Jean-Baptiste Clémence, a former Parisian lawyer, to a stranger he meets in an Amsterdam bar. Over several days, Clémence tells his story, revealing how he descended from respectability and self-satisfaction to his current state of self-aware corruption. Clémence begins by describing his former life in Paris. He was a successful lawyer who specialized in defending noble causes. He took cases involving widows, orphans, and the oppressed. He argued passionately for justice. He enjoyed a reputation as a good man, generous and compassionate. He gave money to beggars, helped the blind across streets, and always defended the weak. But this virtue was not quite what it appeared. Clémence admits that he performed these good deeds primarily to feel superior. He enjoyed the gratitude of those he helped. He savored the admiration he received for his generosity. His morality was a form of pride, a way of placing himself above others. He was not genuinely good, but rather narcissistic, using virtue to feed his ego. His comfortable self-image shattered one night on a bridge over the Seine. He was walking home late when he passed a young woman standing by the railing. He walked past her without speaking. Moments later, he heard the sound of a body hitting water and then cries for help. The woman had jumped from the bridge. Clement stopped, but did not go back. He did not call for help or attempt a rescue. He simply stood there, frozen, and then walked away. The woman drowned. He never reported the incident or acknowledged his failure to act. He went on with his life as if nothing had happened. But the memory haunted him. He began to question all his previous good deeds. Had he ever acted from genuine compassion or always from self-satisfaction? When he helped someone, was he responding to their need or to his own desire to feel virtuous? The incident on the bridge revealed that his nobility had limits. When helping would cost him something, risk, discomfort, inconvenience, he did nothing. This realization destroyed his peace of mind. He could no longer see himself as a good man. He noticed hypocrisy everywhere in his behavior. His generosity was calculated. His compassion was selective. His justice was self-serving. The noble lawyer was actually a vain egotist who used morality as a tool for self-aggrandizement. Clemence's descent accelerated. He began drinking heavily. He pursued casual sexual encounters without emotional connection. He abandoned his legal practice and his respectable life. He left Paris and eventually settled in Amsterdam, where he now works as a judge penitent in a seedy bar frequented by sailors and criminals. The term judge penitent describes his current role. He confesses his own sins to strangers, sparing no detail of his hypocrisy and moral failure. But this confession is not genuine repentance. Rather, it is a strategy. By admitting his own guilt first, he earns the right to judge others. He demonstrates that everyone is guilty, that all virtue is hypocrisy, that no one can claim moral superiority. This strategy allows Clemence to feel superior again, but in a different way. He is superior not because he is good, but because he is honest about his badness. He has the courage to admit what others conceal. He sees through moral pretensions that others cling to. His cynicism becomes its own form of pride. The novel's title refers to humanity's fall from grace, but also to Clemence's personal fall from self-satisfaction to self-knowledge. In Christian theology, the fall describes humanity's expulsion from paradise through disobedience. In Clemence's story, the fall is from innocence to the knowledge of his own hypocrisy and corruption. But the novel complicates this theme. Is Clemence more honest after his fall, or simply more cynical? Has he achieved genuine self-knowledge, or just replaced one form of self-deception with another? Is his confession authentic, or another performance designed to manipulate his audience? The unnamed listener in the bar serves as the reader's surrogate. Clemence addresses him directly, drawing him into complicity. By the end, it becomes clear that Clemence is not simply telling his story, but accusing his listener. He suggests that the listener is no different, that he too harbors hypocrisies and moral failures that he refuses to acknowledge. This accusatory dimension makes the fall deeply uncomfortable. The reader cannot maintain distance from Clemence. His confession implicates everyone. We are all judge penitents, hiding our failures behind respectable facades, using morality to feel superior while avoiding genuine ethical demands. The novel was widely interpreted as Camus's response to his critics, particularly those who attacked him after The Rebel. He had been accused of moral superiority, of judging others while positioning himself above political conflicts. The Fall seemed to acknowledge these criticisms by creating a narrator who embodies hypocritical judgment. But the novel is more than self-defense or self-criticism. It explores the impossibility of genuine virtue in a fallen world. Clemence argues that no action can be purely good because all actions are contaminated by self-interest, pride, and desire for recognition. Even apparent self-sacrifice serves hidden egoistic purposes. This position challenges the ethics Camus developed in earlier works. In The Plague, WWII fights disease from simple decency without claiming heroism. In The Rebel, authentic revolt maintains moral limits. These positions assume that genuine goodness is possible, that some actions can be motivated by legitimate concern for others. The Fall questions these assumptions. Perhaps WWII fights the plague partly to feel good about himself. Perhaps the rebel's moral limits serve his need to feel superior to revolutionary extremists. Perhaps all ethics reduces to disguised selfishness and will to power. The novel's Amsterdam setting reinforces its themes. Amsterdam is built below sea level, protected by dikes and canals. It is literally a fallen city, existing where it should not, saved from drowning by human engineering. The city's circular canals suggest Dante's circles of hell, descending inward toward ultimate corruption. Clemens describes Amsterdam as the last circle, where everyone is guilty. In the city of merchants and sailors, moral pretensions dissolve. People pursue pleasure, profit, and survival without claiming higher purposes. This honesty appeals to Clemens. Amsterdam is hell, but at least it does not pretend to be heaven. The novel's style differs markedly from Camus' earlier fiction. The long monologue allows no other perspective to balance Clemens's cynical view. The reader has no choice but to listen to his poisonous eloquence. The prose is elaborate and rhetorical, full of irony and classical allusions. It displays Clemens's intelligence while revealing his manipulation. Critics have debated how to read the novel. Is Clemens simply a character whom Camus created and judged, or does he speak for Camus himself? Does the novel represent genuine nihilism, or a warning against nihilism? Is it a descent into cynicism, or a purgative exercise designed to move beyond cynicism? There are no definitive answers to these questions. The Fall is deliberately ambiguous. It can be read as Camus' darkest vision of human nature, or as his critique of that vision. It might represent a temporary crisis in his thinking, or a permanent shift toward greater pessimism. The novel resists simple interpretation. What is clear is that The Fall expresses profound disillusionment. The man who wrote it had lived through war, political controversy, personal turmoil, and the Algerian conflict. He had witnessed human cruelty and experienced betrayal. He had discovered limits to his own courage and honesty. This accumulation of experience produced a darker, more skeptical vision than his earlier work. Yet even in its darkness, The Fall displays Camus' literary craftsmanship. The monologue is perfectly controlled. Clemens's voice is consistent and compelling. The gradual revelation of his story builds effectively. The accusatory conclusion delivers its impact with precision. As a technical achievement, the novel ranks among Camus' best work. The book's reception was mixed. Some critics praised its honesty and psychological depth. Others found it cynical and self-indulgent. Readers who loved The Stranger and The Plague were often disappointed by the darker tone, but the novel established itself as an important work, frequently taught and studied alongside Camus' more famous books. The Fall raises questions about whether ethical life is possible, whether genuine virtue exists, whether we can ever escape self-deception and moral hypocrisy. These are not questions Camus definitively answers. The novel leaves them hanging, troubling, and unresolved. This ambiguity might be seen as a weakness, or as an honest acknowledgement that some questions have no satisfying answers. Theater of Ideas, Camus the Playwright. Throughout his career, Albert Camus maintained a deep and abiding passion for theater. While he is remembered primarily as a novelist and philosopher, he devoted enormous energy to dramatic works, writing plays, adapting novels for the stage, and directing productions. Theater offered him something that solitary writing could not: collaboration, embodied performance, and direct connection with audiences. Camus's love of theater began in his youth. As a student in Algiers, he founded a theater company called the Théâtre du Travail, later renamed the Théâtre de l'Équipe. The company aimed to bring serious drama to working-class audiences. They performed in community halls and union buildings rather than conventional theaters. The repertoire included adaptations of classic works and new plays addressing contemporary social issues. This early experience shaped Camus' understanding of theater's purpose. Drama should not be mere entertainment for the elite, but a forum for exploring ideas and engaging communities. Theater could make philosophical questions concrete and accessible. Abstract concepts became vivid when embodied by actors speaking and moving on stage. His first major play, Caligula, was written in 1938 but not performed until 1945. The play dramatizes the story of the Roman Emperor Caligula, who descended into tyranny and madness after the death of his sister Drusilla, with whom he had an incestuous relationship. Caligula's grief leads him to a nihilistic revelation: people die and they are not happy. This recognition of life's absurdity drives him to exercise absolute power without moral restraint. Caligula becomes a monster deliberately. He humiliates senators, confiscates property arbitrarily, forces men to watch their sons' executions, and demands to be worshipped as a god. His actions are not random cruelty, but a systematic demonstration that nothing has meaning, that power is the only reality, that human life has no inherent value. The play explores what happens when someone fully embraces nihilism and has the power to act on it. Caligula understands that life is absurd, but instead of maintaining his humanity in spite of this recognition, he uses it as justification for unlimited cruelty. He represents the danger Camus warned against, that recognizing the absurd could lead to destructive nihilism rather than ethical revolt. The character Chorea, one of the conspirators who eventually assassinates Caligula, articulates the alternative position. He also understands that life has no inherent meaning, but he believes that this recognition should lead to human solidarity and mutual respect, not to tyranny. Even in an absurd universe, we can choose to be decent to each other. Caligula's error is not his philosophy, but his conclusion that absurdity justifies cruelty. The play ends with Caligula's assassination. In his final moments, he achieves a kind of lucidity. He recognizes that his path was wrong, that his absolute freedom led to absolute destruction. But this recognition comes too late. He dies knowing he has failed, that his experiment in living without limits has proven nothing except the necessity of limits. Caligula was tremendously successful when finally produced. It spoke to audiences who had lived through World War II and witnessed what happened when leaders embraced nihilistic ideologies. The play demonstrated that ideas have consequences, that philosophical positions translate into political realities that kill real people. Camus' second major play, The Misunderstanding, premiered in 1944. It tells a dark story of a man named Jan who returns home after many years abroad. He has made his fortune and wants to help his mother and sister who run an inn. But instead of revealing his identity immediately, he checks into the inn as a guest, intending to surprise them. His mother and sister, who do not recognize him, have a secret business. They murder wealthy guests, steal their money, and dump the bodies in a nearby river. Jan becomes their victim. Only after they have killed him do they discover his true identity. The mother commits suicide in despair. The sister is left alone with the knowledge that she murdered her own brother. The play explores themes of recognition, communication, and fate. Jan's death results from a failure of recognition. If he had simply announced who he was, the tragedy could have been avoided. But he chose to maintain disguise, perhaps testing whether he would be recognized, perhaps enjoying a game that proved fatal. The play is relentlessly dark. There is no redemption, no consolation, no suggestion that the suffering has meaning. The universe of The Misunderstanding is completely indifferent to human concerns. The characters call out for help or meaning, but no answer comes. The sister's final words are a bitter rejection of any consoling interpretation. Pray your God to harden you to stone. It's the happiness he has assigned himself. The Misunderstanding was less successful than Caligula. Audiences found it excessively bleak. Critics complained that the plot relied on an implausible coincidence and that the characters lacked psychological depth. But the play effectively dramatized Camus' philosophy that the universe provides no justice or meaning, that human beings must create value in a fundamentally indifferent cosmos. Beyond his original plays, Camus devoted considerable energy to adapting works by other writers for the stage. He adapted Dostoevsky's The Possessed into a play that explored totalitarian psychology. He adapted William Faulkner's Requiem for a Nun, bringing the American novelist's complex narrative to French theater. He adapted plays by Calderón and Lope de Vega from Spanish. These adaptations were not mere translations. Camus reimagined the works for contemporary audiences, emphasizing themes that resonated with his own philosophical concerns. His adaptation of The Possessed stressed the novel's critique of revolutionary fanaticism, making explicit connections to 20th century totalitarianism that Dostoevsky could not have foreseen. Camus also worked as a director, staging productions of his own works and adaptations. He was deeply involved in all aspects of production, casting, design, rehearsal. He worked closely with actors to achieve the performances he envisioned. This hands-on involvement sometimes created tension with theater professionals who had their own ideas about staging. His directing style emphasized clarity and simplicity. He disliked elaborate sets or unnecessary theatrical effects. He wanted to focus on the text and the actors' performances. The stage should serve the ideas rather than distracting from them with spectacle. This aesthetic reflected his belief that theater's power comes from the direct encounter between performers and audience, not from technical wizardry. Theater also provided Camus with community and collaboration. Writing is solitary work. The novelist sits alone with the page, working through ideas without immediate feedback. Theater is collective. It requires actors, designers, technicians, directors working together toward a common goal. This collaborative dimension appealed to Camus' need for human connection. Many of his close relationships developed through theatrical work. He directed and befriended actors. He collaborated with designers and producers. These relationships provided personal satisfaction and helped combat the isolation that troubled him. The theater community became a kind of family that supplemented and sometimes replaced his biological family. His affair with Maria Casares developed partly through their theatrical collaboration. She performed in several of his productions, and they spent countless hours together in rehearsal. The intensity of theatrical work, long hours, shared creative challenges, the intimacy of performance, created bonds that sometimes became romantic. Theater also allowed Camus to address political and philosophical questions in more accessible form than essays or novels. A philosophical essay requires sustained concentration from readers. A novel demands time and literary sophistication. But theater can reach broader audiences. People who would never read The Myth of Sisyphus might attend a production of Caligula and encounter similar ideas through drama. This democratic dimension of theater appealed to Camus' political values. He believed that ideas should not be restricted to intellectual elites. Philosophy and literature should serve ordinary people, helping them understand their lives and their world. Theater could bridge the gap between intellectual culture and popular audiences. His final theatrical project was an adaptation of Dostoevsky's The Possessed, which premiered in 1959. The production was ambitious, with a large cast and complex staging. Camus threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. The rehearsal process consumed months of his time and energy. The production received mixed reviews. Some critics praised the adaptation and the performances, others found it overlong and heavy-handed, but the experience gave Camus satisfaction. He was doing work he loved, collaborating with talented artists, engaging with Dostoevsky's profound exploration of political fanaticism and moral chaos. Theater remained central to Camus's creative life until his death. Even as his health declined and his other work slowed, he continued thinking about dramatic projects. He made plans for new productions and adaptations. The theater represented vitality, community, and the possibility of reaching people directly with ideas that mattered. His plays have been performed countless times since his death. Caligula remains part of the international theatrical repertoire, staged by companies around the world. His adaptations introduced French audiences to works they might not otherwise have encountered. His directorial vision influenced subsequent generations of theater artists. Camus' theatrical work demonstrates that philosophical ideas can be dramatized effectively. Abstract concepts like the absurd, nihilism, and revolt become concrete when embodied by characters in conflict. Audiences watch these ideas play out through action and consequence, making philosophy immediate and emotionally engaging rather than merely intellectual. The theater also provided Camus with an alternative mode of expression when other forms of writing became difficult. During periods when he struggled with novels or essays, he could turn to drama and adaptation. The change of form refreshed his creativity and allowed him to continue working even when blocked in other genres. The First Man, unfinished masterpiece. At the time of his death in January 1960, Albert Camus was working on a novel that many scholars believe would have been his greatest work. The First Man was an autobiographical novel about his childhood in Algeria, a return to his origins after years of fame and philosophical abstraction. The manuscript, unfinished and unrevised, was found in the wreckage of the car accident that killed him. The novel tells the story of Jacques Comeri, a writer who returns to Algeria in middle age. He visits his father's grave for the first time and realizes that his father died at a younger age than Jacques is now. This reversal, the son older than the father, prompts reflection on family, memory, and identity. Jacques embarks on a search for his origins, trying to understand the man he never knew and the world that shaped him. The narrative alternates between Jacques' present-day search and memories of his childhood. Camus writes about his mother's silence, his grandmother's harshness, the poverty of their home. He describes the streets of Belcourt, the beach, the school where his teacher Louis Germain changed his life. The details are precise and sensory: the smell of kerosene lamps, the texture of rough sheets, the taste of bread and olive oil. These passages contain some of Camus's most beautiful prose. He writes about his childhood without sentimentality, but with profound tenderness. The poverty is not romanticized or explained away. It simply is, along with the moments of joy and beauty that poverty could not eliminate. The sun, the sea, the friendship of other boys, the pleasure of running and swimming, these existed alongside hunger and deprivation. The novel's title has multiple meanings. Jacques is trying to discover who the first man was, his father, the origin of his existence. But First Man also suggests Adam, the biblical first human, representing humanity's fundamental condition. And it suggests the colonist or settler, the European who came to Algeria and made it home, becoming a first man in a new land. This last meaning points to one of the novel's central concerns. Camus writes about the Pied Noir experience, about people whose families had lived in Algeria for generations, but who were never fully of that place. They spoke French, not Arabic. They identified as French, even though many had never seen France. They belonged to Algeria, but were not Algerian in the same way as the Arab population. The novel explores this ambiguous identity without resolving it. Jacques loves Algeria with fierce passion. The land shaped him. Its sun and sea gave him life. But he also recognizes the injustice of colonialism, the suffering it caused to the indigenous population. He is caught between love for place and recognition of the wrong that his presence there represents. Camus writes about his father with particular poignancy. Lucien Camus remains almost entirely unknown to his son. Jacques learns a few facts. His father worked in a wine cellar. He was gentle and kind. He once became violently ill after witnessing an execution. But these fragments hardly constitute a person. The father is an absence, a silence at the center of Jacques' identity. This absence shapes Jacques in ways he struggles to understand. Without a father, he had no model of masculinity, no guide to becoming a man. He made himself up as he went, constructing an identity from books, friendships, and his own imagination. This improvisation gave him freedom, but also left him unmoored, searching for something he could never name. The novel also examines the relationship between mother and son. Camus writes about Catherine's deafness and near muteness with heartbreaking clarity. She cannot fully express herself. She cannot share her inner life with her son, yet Jacques loves her with desperate intensity. Her silence becomes a kind of purity, an innocence that contrasts with the complexity and dishonesty of the articulate world. There is a scene where Jacques tries to tell his mother about his success as a writer. She does not fully understand what he does or why people admire him. His fame means nothing to her. She loves him simply because he is her son. This unconditional love, free from judgment or expectation, moves Jacques deeply. It represents a kind of grace that his sophisticated Parisian life lacks. The manuscript includes extensive passages about Jacques' education. Camus writes about the scholarship examination that allowed him to continue school, about his teacher's intervention with his family, about the world of books that opened to him. Education is portrayed as both liberation and alienation. It freed him from poverty's limitations, but also separated him from his mother and his origins. The novel contains very little plot in the conventional sense. It is structured more like a memoir than a novel, following the movement of memory and reflection rather than dramatic action. This structure suits Camus' purpose. He is not telling a story so much as excavating a life, trying to recover and understand experiences that shaped him before he was old enough to comprehend their significance. The prose style differs noticeably from Camus' earlier fiction. The controlled, spare sentences of The Stranger give way to longer, more lyrical passages. The emotional tone is warmer, less detached. The narrator allows himself feeling and vulnerability that Meursault never displayed. This shift suggests that Camus was moving toward a different kind of writing in his final years. The manuscript is incomplete and unrevised. Many passages are rough. Some sections are just notes indicating what Camus intended to write. The narrative breaks off before reaching any conclusion. We cannot know how he would have finished the book or what the final version would have looked like. But even in its unfinished state, The First Man is a powerful work. It shows Camus returning to his sources, writing about the experiences that made him. After years of philosophical abstraction and political controversy, he came back to the concrete details of a childhood lived in poverty and sunlight on the North African coast. The novel was not published until 1994, more than 30 years after Camus' death. His daughter Catherine, who controlled his literary estate, finally allowed its publication. Readers and critics immediately recognized its value. Many consider it Camus' most moving work, more emotionally honest and vulnerable than anything he published during his lifetime. The book provides insight into Camus that his published works concealed. He appears less as the famous intellectual and more as a man trying to understand where he came from and who he was beneath the public persona. The novel is a search for authenticity, for the real self buried under layers of education, fame, and philosophical sophistication. It also complicates our understanding of Camus' relationship to Algeria. His political positions during the war for independence seem more comprehensible when we understand how deeply he identified with the place and its people, including the poor French settlers who were his family and community. His inability to support independence unequivocally was not just political calculation, but personal agony. The novel suggests that Camus might have been moving toward new artistic territory had he lived. The autobiographical material he was exploring could have opened paths beyond the philosophical fiction of his earlier work. He might have developed a more personal, less allegorical mode of writing that drew directly on memory and experience. Some passages in the manuscript are extraordinary by any standard. The descriptions of childhood games, of swimming in the Mediterranean, of his mother's silent presence in the apartment, these rank among the finest prose Camus ever wrote. They demonstrate that his powers as a writer were not diminished by age or the controversies that troubled his later years. The First Man also addresses questions of memory and history. Jacques seeks to recover the past, but he discovers that much is irretrievable. People who knew his father are dead or cannot remember clearly. Documents are scarce. The past exists mainly as fragments, hints, echoes, yet the attempt to recover it matters. The search itself gives meaning even if complete recovery is impossible. The novel ends abruptly in mid-sentence. The last words describe Jacques continuing his search, still trying to understand. This incompleteness is fitting. The search for origins can never be completed. We can never fully recover or understand where we came from. But the search remains necessary, a way of honoring what shaped us and trying to make sense of who we became. Journalism as mission, the power of words. Before Albert Camus became a famous novelist and philosopher, he was a journalist. Throughout his career, he returned repeatedly to journalism as a form of engagement with the world. He believed that newspapers could serve truth and justice, that words could combat lies and oppression. This faith in journalism's power shaped his political commitments and his understanding of the writer's responsibility. Camus began his journalistic career in 1938 at Algeria Republicain, a left-wing newspaper in Algiers. The paper took progressive positions on social issues and criticized the colonial administration. As a young reporter, Camus covered courts, local politics, and social conditions. He learned the craft of journalism, how to gather facts, interview sources, structure articles, and write on deadline. His most significant early journalism consisted of a series of articles about conditions in the Kabylia region of Algeria. In 1939, he traveled through impoverished Berber villages documenting the extreme poverty, malnutrition, and government neglect. His reports described families living in caves, children dying of starvation, peasants working for wages that could not sustain life. These articles were detailed and factual. Camus cited statistics, quoted officials, described what he personally witnessed. He avoided inflammatory language or emotional appeals. The facts themselves were damning enough. He demonstrated that colonialism had created a system that condemned indigenous people to misery while Europeans prospered. The colonial authorities reacted with hostility. They pressured advertisers to withdraw support from the newspaper. They denied access to official sources. They made it clear that continued publication of such articles would have consequences. The pressure worked. The newspaper's financial situation deteriorated. Within a year, Alger Republicain had closed. This experience taught Camus about the limits of journalism in an authoritarian context. Truth-telling brings retaliation. Power defends itself against exposure. A free press depends on a society willing to tolerate criticism. In colonial Algeria, that willingness did not exist, at least not when criticism targeted the colonial system itself. When Camus moved to France and joined the resistance, journalism became his primary form of resistance. The underground newspaper, Combat, provided information that censored publications could not report. It maintained morale and demonstrated that opposition to occupation continued despite German power. Working on Combat during the occupation was dangerous. The Gestapo actively hunted members of resistance networks. Being caught with underground newspapers meant arrest, torture, and likely death. Distribution required elaborate precautions. Writers used pseudonyms. Printers moved constantly. Readers destroyed copies after reading them. Camus wrote editorials and articles arguing that resistance was both possible and necessary. He insisted that even under totalitarian rule, individuals could maintain their dignity and refuse complicity with evil. He articulated moral arguments against collaboration that went beyond mere nationalism or political calculation. After liberation, Combat continued as a legal newspaper with Camus as editor-in-chief. The paper became one of the most influential voices in French public life. It advocated for political renewal, not just a return to pre-war conditions. It called for purging collaborators while maintaining legal standards. It tried to articulate an ethical vision for post-war France. Camus used his editorials to address the most pressing questions of the moment. Should collaborators be executed? How many? Based on what standards? He argued for justice but against vengeance, for accountability but against mob rule. These positions pleased no one. The right thought he was too harsh. The left thought he was too lenient. He also wrote about broader political issues, the atomic bomb, the beginning of the Cold War, the future of Europe. He warned against replacing Nazi totalitarianism with Soviet totalitarianism. He argued that means and ends cannot be separated, that just goals require just methods. These themes would later appear in The Rebel, but were first developed in his journalism. Camus' journalistic style was clear, direct, and factual. He avoided rhetorical excess and emotional manipulation. He presented arguments based on evidence and reasoning. He assumed readers were intelligent enough to evaluate facts and draw conclusions. This respect for the audience distinguished his work from propaganda, which assumes readers need to be manipulated rather than informed. He also maintained ethical standards in his journalism. He fact-checked rigorously. He corrected errors when they occurred. He distinguished between verified facts and speculation. He acknowledged the limits of his knowledge. These practices seem basic, but they were not universal even then. Many newspapers prioritized political agenda over accuracy. By 1947, Camus had become exhausted by editorial responsibilities. Journalism demanded constant attention to current events. Every day brought new issues requiring response. There was no time for reflection or sustained creative work. His health was suffering. His relationships were strained. He needed to write fiction and philosophy, work that required solitude and time. He resigned as editor of Combat and reduced his journalistic activities. But he never abandoned journalism entirely. He continued writing occasional articles and essays for newspapers and magazines. He used journalism to intervene in public debates when issues arose that demanded his attention. His journalism during the Algerian War illustrated both the power and limits of his approach. He wrote articles calling for civilian protection and negotiated settlement. He tried to use his platform to reduce violence and promote dialogue, but his position satisfied no one. The articles brought him attacks from all sides without noticeably affecting the conflict's trajectory. This failure troubled him. He had believed that honest, well-reasoned arguments could influence political events. But the Algerian War demonstrated that words have limits. In the face of violence, hatred, and entrenched positions, rational argument often proves ineffective. This recognition contributed to his eventual silence on the issue. Yet Camus never entirely lost faith in journalism's potential. He continued to believe that information and analysis could help people understand their world. A free press was essential to democracy and human dignity. Journalists had responsibility to report truthfully regardless of political convenience. He saw journalism as related to his literary and philosophical work. All were forms of witnessing, of paying attention to reality and reporting what he found. The journalist witnesses current events. The novelist witnesses human nature and experience. The philosopher witnesses fundamental questions about existence and meaning. All require honesty, courage, and commitment to truth. Camus's journalism has been collected and published in multiple volumes. Reading these articles provides insight into how he thought about immediate political questions. His philosophical positions were not abstract, but developed in response to concrete historical situations. The journalism shows the philosopher engaging with the messy reality of politics, not just theoretical principles. Some of his finest writing appears in his journalistic work. The Kabylia articles contain vivid descriptions and compelling arguments. The Combat editorials articulate moral positions with clarity and force. The occasional essays on political and cultural topics demonstrate his ability to address diverse subjects with intelligence and style. Journalism also kept Camus connected to social reality in ways that might otherwise have eluded a successful writer. It forced him to pay attention to events outside his personal concerns. It required him to gather facts, interview people, and engage with perspectives different from his own. This grounding in reality prevented his philosophy from becoming too abstract or detached. His career demonstrates that journalism and literature need not be separate vocations. The same commitment to truth, the same attention to language, the same ethical responsibility applies to both. A novelist can be a journalist, and a journalist can be an artist. The distinction is less important than the quality of observation and the integrity of expression. The Nobel Prize Triumph and Burden at 44. On October 17, 1957, the Swedish Academy announced that Albert Camus had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. At 43 years old, he became the second youngest recipient of the prize in history and the youngest French laureate ever. The honor brought international recognition and financial security. It also brought controversy, criticism, and a burden of expectation that would weigh on him for the rest of his life. The citation praised Camus for his important literary production, which with clear-sighted earnestness illuminates the problems of the human conscience in our times. The Academy recognized his novels, plays, and essays as a body of work that addressed the fundamental questions facing humanity in the 20th century. The prize honored not just literary excellence, but philosophical and moral significance. Camus received the news with mixed feelings. He was pleased by the recognition and grateful for the financial reward, which would provide security for his family. But he also felt that others deserved the prize more. He immediately thought of André Malraux, whose novels had influenced him, and particularly of his mentor Jean Grenier, who had shaped his intellectual development. In letters to friends, Camus expressed discomfort with receiving such an honor at his age. He felt his best work might still be ahead of him, and that the prize imposed pressure to produce masterpieces. He worried that being designated a great writer might actually inhibit his creativity. The Nobel Prize often seems like a culmination, but Camus saw himself as still developing, still searching for his mature voice. The announcement immediately triggered attacks from his critics. Communist intellectuals denounced the award as politically motivated, a Cold War gesture designed to promote an anti-communist writer. They pointed out that Camus had criticized the Soviet Union and rejected revolutionary violence. The prize, they argued, was not recognition of literary merit, but Western propaganda. Some critics suggested that Camus won primarily because of political acceptability rather than artistic achievement. They compared him unfavorably to other French writers who had not received the prize. They questioned whether his body of work truly merited placement alongside previous laureates like Thomas Mann, William Faulkner, and Ernest Hemingway. Even some who admired Camus's work wondered if the prize came too early. He had published no major novel since The Fall in 1956. His most significant philosophical work, The Rebel, dated from 1951. Some observers felt that the Academy was rewarding past achievement rather than recognizing a writer at the height of his powers. Camus traveled to Stockholm in December for the award ceremony. He brought his wife Francine and their twin children. The trip included formal dinners, speeches, and meetings with Swedish royalty and cultural figures. Camus wore formal evening dress, looking uncomfortable in the required ceremonial attire. He was a man who preferred casual clothing and simple settings, now thrust into elaborate protocol. His Nobel lecture, delivered on December 10th, addressed the writer's responsibility in the modern world. Camus argued that writers could not remain neutral in the face of injustice and oppression. They must bear witness to their times, even when doing so brings criticism and controversy. But they must also maintain independence from political parties and ideologies that would use literature for propaganda. He spoke about the writer's double commitment to truth and to freedom. These values sometimes conflict. Truth can be uncomfortable or politically inconvenient. Freedom includes the freedom to be wrong. But writers must pursue both without compromise. They must resist pressure from power, whether that power comes from governments, political movements, or popular opinion. The lecture also addressed the relationship between art and morality. Camus rejected the idea that art serves primarily as entertainment or aesthetic pleasure. Great literature engages with moral questions and human suffering, but it does not reduce to political messaging or moral instruction. Literature explores complexity and ambiguity that simple moral formulas cannot capture. He concluded by emphasizing the writer's solidarity with the oppressed and voiceless. Writers speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. They document suffering that power wants to hide. They preserve memory that authorities want erased. This responsibility is burden and privilege, requiring courage and humility. The speech was well received, though some found it overly general. Camus spoke about the writer's role in abstract terms without addressing specific controversies or taking clear political positions. He avoided mentioning the Soviet Union, Algeria, or other contentious issues. This evasion disappointed those who wanted him to use the platform for more direct political intervention. During his time in Stockholm, Camus participated in various public events. At one gathering with students, a young Algerian woman challenged him about his silence regarding the war. She accused him of abandoning the Algerian people in their struggle for independence. Camus responded with the words that would become infamous: "I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice." This exchange became public and provoked intense controversy. Critics interpreted the statement as revealing that Camus valued his own family and community above universal principles. He was accused of hypocrisy, preaching moral absolutes while practicing tribal loyalty. The statement seemed to confirm that when his own interests were at stake, his philosophy collapsed. But the context was more complicated than the infamous quotation suggests. Camus was responding to someone who seemed to dismiss the deaths of European civilians in Algeria as acceptable costs of liberation. He was asserting that no political cause justifies deliberately targeting innocent people, including his mother. This was consistent with his rejection of revolutionary violence that sacrifices individuals to collective goals. Nevertheless, the damage was done. The statement confirmed for many that Camus could not maintain his philosophical principles when they conflicted with personal attachments. It reinforced his isolation from both the Algerian independence movement and the French left. It provided his enemies with ammunition that would be used against him repeatedly. The Nobel Prize money provided financial security that Camus had never known. He could now write without economic pressure. He could support his family comfortably. He could help friends in need. The financial freedom should have been liberating, allowing him to focus entirely on creative work. But the psychological burden proved heavier than the financial benefit was helpful. Camus now bore the designation of Nobel laureate. Everything he published would be judged against this standard. Critics would ask whether new work justified the prize. The expectation of greatness could paralyze creativity rather than stimulating it. He also faced increased demands on his time. Publishers wanted interviews and essays. Organizations invited him to speak at conferences and ceremonies. Journalists sought his opinions on current events. The volume of correspondence increased dramatically. People he had never met wrote asking for help, advice, or money. Being a Nobel laureate made him a public figure in ways that went beyond his previous fame. Camus struggled with this new status. He had always been private, protective of the time and solitude necessary for writing. Now his privacy was invaded constantly. He could not walk through Paris without being recognized. He could not sit in a cafe without being approached. The Nobel Prize had made him even more visible at a time when he wanted to withdraw from public life. His health continued to deteriorate. The stress of fame, combined with ongoing tuberculosis, left him frequently exhausted and ill. He spent months at a time unable to work. The prize had come when he was already struggling physically and creatively. It added pressure rather than providing relief. Some friends noticed changes in Camus after Stockholm. He seemed more withdrawn, more melancholy. The honor that should have brought joy appeared instead to deepen his sense of burden. He spoke about feeling trapped by expectations, unable to write freely without worrying about whether his work was worthy of a Nobel laureate. He continued working on The First Man, his autobiographical novel about childhood in Algeria. This project represented a return to his sources, an attempt to reconnect with the experiences that had shaped him before fame and philosophy complicated his identity. But progress was slow. The novel remained unfinished at his death. The Nobel Prize also complicated his relationships with other writers. Some were genuinely happy for his success. Others felt envy or resentment. The French literary world was competitive and often petty. Receiving such recognition at a relatively young age created tensions with writers who felt they deserved similar honor. Jean-Paul Sartre, with whom Camus had broken years earlier, was rumored to be bitter about the award. Sartre would himself receive the Nobel Prize in 1964, but would refuse it. Some observers speculated that Sartre's refusal was partly a rebuke to Camus, a demonstration that truly independent intellectuals do not accept establishment honors. Looking back, the Nobel Prize appears as both recognition and curse. It acknowledged Camus' achievements and secured his place in literary history. But it also intensified pressures that were already threatening his creativity and peace of mind. The honor came at a moment when he needed support rather than additional burden. The prize money enabled Camus to purchase a house in Lourmarin, a small village in southern France. The house provided a retreat where he could work quietly, away from Paris and its demands. He spent increasing time there, seeking the peace necessary for writing. The house represented an attempt to create space for the work he still hoped to produce. But time was running out. Less than 3 years after receiving the Nobel Prize, Camus would be dead. The great works that the prize anticipated would never be written. The unfinished manuscript of The First Man would remain in a briefcase, recovered from the wreckage of an automobile, a testament to what might have been. Death of the absurd hero, the fatal accident. On January 4th, 1960, Albert Camus died in a car accident on a road in the French countryside. He was 46 years old, at the height of his fame, working on a novel that might have become his masterpiece. His death was sudden, random, and absurd. Exactly the kind of meaningless event his philosophy had prepared people to accept, yet no less tragic for being philosophically consistent. Camus had spent the Christmas and New Year holiday in Lourmarin, the village in Provence where he had recently purchased a house. He planned to return to Paris in early January. He had a train ticket for the journey, but his publisher, Michel Gallimard, offered to drive him back. Gallimard's wife and daughter would also be in the car. Camus accepted the offer, preferring the company and conversation to traveling alone by train. The group left Lourmarin on January 4th. The weather was clear, the roads dry. They traveled in Gallimard's Facel Vega, a powerful sports car. The journey should have taken several hours, passing through the countryside of southern France before reaching Paris. Somewhere near the town of Villebleven, about 100 kilometers south of Paris, something went wrong. The car left the road at high speed. It struck one tree, then another. The impact was catastrophic. The vehicle was destroyed. Camus died instantly. Gallimard survived initially but died several days later in the hospital. His wife and daughter survived with serious injuries. Investigators never determined the accident's cause with certainty. The most likely explanation was a tire blowout at high speed, causing Gallimard to lose control. Other theories suggested mechanical failure or driver error. There was no evidence of another vehicle being involved, no indication that Gallimard was impaired. The crash appeared to be simply an accident, the random convergence of speed, mechanical failure, and bad luck. In the wreckage, rescuers found Camus's briefcase containing the unfinished manuscript of The First Man. The manuscript was damaged but readable. Also found was the unused train ticket in Camus's pocket. He had chosen to travel by car instead of train, a decision that cost him his life. Had he taken the train as originally planned, he would have arrived safely in Paris. This detail, the unused train ticket, became symbolic. Camus died because of a casual choice between two modes of transportation. There was no grand reason, no meaningful explanation. He simply made a decision that happened to be fatal. This randomness embodied the absurd condition he had written about throughout his career. News of the death shocked France and the international literary community. Camus was at the peak of his fame, only 3 years past receiving the Nobel Prize. He was young enough that readers expected decades more work from him. His sudden death seemed impossible, a mistake that would be corrected when he reappeared alive. But there was no mistake. Tributes poured in from around the world. Sartre, despite their bitter break, published a moving obituary, acknowledging Camus' importance and their lost friendship. Writers, philosophers, and ordinary readers expressed grief and shock. France had lost one of its most significant voices at a moment when that voice was needed. The funeral took place in Lourmarin on January 6th. Camus was buried in the village cemetery rather than in the Pantheon in Paris, where France honors its greatest citizens. This choice reflected his preference for simplicity and his identification with ordinary people rather than the establishment. He was laid to rest in the south, closer to his Mediterranean roots than to the Parisian intellectual world. The accident's absurdity did not escape commentators. Camus had written extensively about death's randomness and life's fundamental meaninglessness. He had argued that we must accept the absurd without false consolation. Now he had died in precisely the kind of meaningless accident his philosophy addressed. The irony was too obvious to ignore. Some saw poetic justice in this. The philosopher of the absurd died absurdly. The man who wrote that we must imagine Sisyphus happy died pushing his own boulder. The author who explored random, unmotivated death in The Stranger experienced random, unmotivated death himself. These observations were made repeatedly in obituaries and critical essays. But such symmetry offers no real consolation. Camus' death was not meaningful simply because it illustrated his philosophy. It remained what it was, a waste, a loss, a tragedy. A man in his mid-40s, still developing as a writer and thinker, was suddenly gone. The work he might have produced would never exist. The questions he might have explored remained unexamined. His family was devastated. Francine lost her husband, though their relationship had been strained by his infidelities. His children lost their father when they were only 14 years old. His mother, who had already lost one son to tuberculosis years earlier, lost Albert. Maria Casares, his longtime lover, lost the man she had loved for 16 years. The literary world lost a major voice. Camus had been one of the defining intellectuals of the post-war era. His novels had shaped how a generation thought about existence and meaning. His essays had influenced political and philosophical debates. His plays had brought ideas to life on stage. This contribution ended abruptly, incomplete. Speculation about what he might have accomplished had he lived inevitably followed. The First Man suggested he was moving in new creative directions, writing with greater personal vulnerability and emotional depth. Some believe it might have been his greatest work, a synthesis of philosophical insight and autobiographical honesty that transcended his earlier fiction. He had also spoken about writing additional philosophical works to complete a cycle. The Myth of Sisyphus addressed the absurd. The Rebel addressed revolt. He planned a third volume addressing love or creation, but only preliminary notes existed. This final part of his philosophical project remained unrealized. His death also prevented any reconciliation with Sartre or resolution of their philosophical disagreements. The two men never spoke after their 1952 break. Had Camus lived longer, time might have healed the rift, or at least allowed for mutual respect despite differences. Instead, the relationship ended in permanent estrangement. The break never mended. The accident's circumstances seemed almost designed to illustrate meaninglessness. No drunk driver caused it, no villain was responsible, no comprehensible chain of cause and effect explained why it happened on that particular stretch of road at that particular moment. A tire failed or did not fail. A driver reacted one way instead of another. These tiny factors determined life and death. This is precisely the kind of universe Camus' philosophy described. Events happen without moral logic. Death comes without regard for desert or achievement. The universe does not care about human purposes or plans. A man working on an important novel dies before completing it not because of any meaningful reason, but because of mechanical failure and physics. Yet even accepting this philosophical framework does not eliminate grief or make the loss acceptable. Understanding that death is absurd does not make individual deaths less tragic. Camus' own philosophy acknowledged this. We recognize the absurd and live anyway. We mourn losses even knowing that loss is inevitable and meaningless. In his final years, Camus had seemed to be finding some peace. The house in Lourmarin provided retreat from Paris pressures. His work on The First Man was reconnecting him with his sources. He was thinking about new projects. Friends reported that he seemed calmer, less burdened by controversy and criticism. Then suddenly, he was gone. The cultural impact of his death extended beyond literature. Camus had been a moral voice, someone who articulated principles for living in an age of ideology and violence. His death left a vacuum. Who would speak with similar authority about resisting totalitarianism while maintaining ethical standards? Who would advocate solidarity without surrendering to revolutionary absolutism? Years later, some conspiracy theories emerged suggesting that Camus's death was not accidental. These theories pointed to his criticism of Soviet Union and his knowledge of communist activities in France. They suggested that Soviet agents sabotaged the car, but no credible evidence supports these speculations. The accident appears to have been exactly what it seemed, a random mechanical failure with fatal consequences. The unused train ticket remained a haunting detail, such a small choice, car or train, with such enormous consequences. This encapsulated the precariousness of existence. Our lives depend on countless small decisions whose importance we cannot know in advance. We choose one path rather than another, and the choice determines everything. Camus had written, "There is only one really serious philosophical question, and that is suicide." He argued that recognizing life's absurdity should not lead to self-destruction, but to passionate engagement with existence. He lived by this principle, embracing life despite understanding its fundamental meaninglessness. Then a tire blew out and the question became moot. Legacy and influence, Camus today. More than 6 decades after his death, Albert Camus remains one of the most widely read and influential writers of the 20th century. His novels have been translated into dozens of languages and continue to sell millions of copies worldwide. His philosophical essays are taught in universities across the globe. His ideas have influenced writers, filmmakers, musicians, and ordinary readers seeking to understand their place in an indifferent universe. The Stranger has become one of the defining novels of modern literature. Its opening line, "Mother died today," or maybe yesterday, I don't know, is instantly recognizable to readers around the world. The novel appears on countless lists of books everyone should read. It is assigned in high school and college courses. It has influenced subsequent generations of writers who learned from Camus' spare prose style and philosophical depth. The novel's protagonist, Meursault, has become an archetype, the alienated individual who refuses to play by society's rules, who lives authentically even when authenticity brings condemnation. This figure appears throughout contemporary literature and film, from noir detective stories to independent cinema. The emotionally detached narrator has become a standard technique, though few writers use it with Camus' precision. The plague gained renewed relevance during the COVID-19 pandemic. Readers rediscovered Camus' novel about a city sealed off by epidemic disease. the book's exploration of how people respond to catastrophe, how communities organize resistance to overwhelming threats, how individuals maintain humanity in the face of mass death, all resonated with contemporary experience. The novel reminds readers that plague returns cyclically, that the bacillus never truly dies, that vigilance is always necessary. This warning applied not just to disease, but to political evils that lie dormant before re-emerging. Each generation faces its own plagues and must decide whether to fight or surrender, whether to maintain ethical standards or abandon them in crisis. Camus's philosophy of the absurd continues to influence how people think about meaning and purpose. In an increasingly secular age, when traditional religious frameworks no longer provide automatic answers, Camus offers an alternative. Life can be affirmed without believing in God or cosmic purpose. We can create our own meaning through how we live and what we choose to value. This message resonates particularly with young readers encountering existential questions for the first time. Camus provides vocabulary and concepts for articulating feelings they may have experienced but not understood. The recognition that life is absurd can be liberating rather than depressing. It frees people from the burden of finding transcendent justification for existence. His political thought has also remained relevant. Camus' rejection of revolutionary violence and his insistence on maintaining moral limits, even when fighting injustice, influenced later human rights movements. His critique of totalitarianism proved prescient as communist regimes collapsed, revealing the crimes he had warned about. The debate between Camus and Sartre about means and ends, about whether revolutionary goals justify violent methods, continues in new forms. Contemporary arguments about terrorism, regime change, and humanitarian intervention echo their exchange. Can we fight evil without becoming evil? Can we maintain principles while engaged in political struggle? These questions remain unresolved. Camus' concept of revolt has influenced social movements that seek change without revolutionary violence. His insistence that authentic revolt maintains solidarity with others and respects human limits provided a framework for nonviolent resistance. Figures like Václav Havel and other dissidents in communist Eastern Europe cited Camus as an influence. His work has also influenced popular culture in unexpected ways. Musicians have written songs inspired by The Stranger. Filmmakers have adapted his works and borrowed his themes. Video games have explored absurdist philosophy through interactive narratives. Camus has entered the broader culture beyond academic philosophy and literary studies. The aesthetic of his prose continues to influence writers. The clear, declarative sentences of The Stranger demonstrated that philosophical depth need not require complex syntax or elaborate vocabulary. Simple language can express profound ideas. This lesson has shaped minimalist fiction from Raymond Carver to contemporary short story writers. Camus' Mediterranean sensibility, his celebration of sun, sea, and physical pleasure, offers an alternative to Northern European pessimism. In a culture often characterized by anxiety and denial of the body, Camus reminds readers that physical existence has value. Swimming, running, making love, feeling the sun on your skin, these experiences matter even if they lead nowhere beyond themselves. His journalism has become increasingly relevant as debates about media ethics and truth intensify. Camus' commitment to factual accuracy, his resistance to propaganda, his belief that journalism serves the public rather than power. These principles seem more necessary than ever in an age of misinformation and partisan media. Academic studies of Camus continue to proliferate. Scholars examine his relationships, his politics, his philosophical positions, his literary techniques. New biographies appear regularly, each offering different perspectives on his life and work. His manuscripts and correspondence are studied for insights into his creative process. Some contemporary scholars have critiqued aspects of Camus' work that earlier readers overlooked or excused. His treatment of Arab characters in The Stranger has been examined through post-colonial theory. His silence during the Algerian War has been re-evaluated. His relationships with women have been scrutinized through feminist perspectives. These critiques complicate but do not erase his significance. The question of whether Camus was an existentialist continues to be debated. He rejected the label, insisting that his philosophy of the absurd differed from Sartre's existentialism. But popular understanding often groups them together. In common usage, both Camus and Sartre represent existentialist thought despite their philosophical and personal differences. Camus' image has become iconic. Photographs show him in a trench coat, cigarette in hand, looking seriously into the camera. This image suggests intellectual engagement, moral seriousness, and understated style. It has been reproduced on posters, t-shirts, and coffee mugs, transforming a writer into a cultural symbol. But beneath the iconography lies substantial work that rewards serious engagement. Reading Camus today, we encounter a mind grappling honestly with questions that have not disappeared. How should we live knowing we will die? Can we create meaning in a meaningless universe? How do we resist injustice without becoming unjust ourselves? His answers may not satisfy everyone. His positions on specific issues may seem dated or inadequate, but the questions he asked remain vital. Each generation must confront the absurd in its own way. Camus provides not solutions, but a model of how to face existence without illusions yet without despair. The continuing relevance of his work suggests that he addressed something fundamental about the human condition, rather than merely responding to temporary historical circumstances. The specific contexts change: Nazi occupation, communist totalitarianism, Algerian independence. But the underlying questions persist. Contemporary readers find in Camus permission to acknowledge life's difficulties while still embracing it. He does not offer false optimism or comforting lies. He admits that existence is hard, that suffering is real, that death negates everything. Yet he insists that life can be lived fully and joyfully despite these truths. This combination of honesty and affirmation continues to speak to people seeking authentic ways to live. Living without appeal, Camus' message for our time. Albert Camus left behind a body of work that continues to offer guidance for living in a world without transcendent meaning. His philosophy of the absurd, his concept of revolt, his insistence on moral limits, these ideas provide a framework for confronting the challenges of contemporary existence. In an age of crisis, uncertainty, and competing ideologies, Camus' message remains urgently relevant. The central insight of his work is that we must live without appeal to anything beyond immediate human experience. There is no God to guarantee justice. There is no historical law ensuring progress. There is no cosmic order that will reward virtue or punish wickedness. We are alone in an indifferent universe, and we must create meaning and value through our own choices and actions. This recognition could lead to nihilism and despair. If nothing has inherent meaning, why not abandon all principles and pursue only pleasure or power? Camus answers that the absence of transcendent meaning does not eliminate human values. Even without God or cosmic purpose, we can recognize that suffering is bad and should be reduced, that freedom is good and should be protected, that human dignity deserves respect. These values do not need external justification. They emerge from our experience of being human. We know pain hurts. We know freedom feels better than slavery. We know that being treated with respect is preferable to being degraded. These immediate experiences provide sufficient foundation for ethics without requiring metaphysical or theological support. Camus teaches that accepting the absurd should lead to passionate engagement with life, not withdrawal. If this existence is all we have, we should squeeze as much experience as possible from the time available. We should work, love, create, and enjoy the physical world. We should not defer happiness to some imagined future or sacrifice present life for abstract goals. But this embrace of life must maintain ethical limits. We cannot pursue our own pleasure or freedom by destroying others. Even in an absurd universe, solidarity and mutual respect remain necessary. We are all in the same condition, facing the same ultimate fate. This shared vulnerability should create bonds rather than justifying competition and cruelty. His concept of revolt provides a model for political engagement without ideological dogmatism. We should resist injustice when we encounter it. We should say no to oppression and cruelty, but we should not claim to possess absolute truth about how society should be organized. We should not sacrifice individuals to collective visions of future perfection. This moderate position frustrates those who want total commitment to revolutionary causes. But Camus believed that moderation requires more courage than fanaticism. It is easier to embrace a system that explains everything and justifies any action than to live with uncertainty while still maintaining principles. It is harder to fight injustice without becoming unjust than to adopt methods that mirror the evil we oppose. For contemporary readers, this message challenges both political extremes. Against the right's defense of inequality and hierarchy, Camus insists that all humans deserve dignity and that systems can be changed. Against the left's revolutionary violence and ideological certainty, he insists on moral limits and skepticism about utopian promises. He offers a third position that is politically engaged without being totalitarian. His work also speaks to personal questions about how to live authentically. Camus teaches that we should not pretend to feelings we do not have or beliefs we do not hold. We should not perform emotions to satisfy social expectations. We should not lie about our experiences to make ourselves appear more virtuous or successful than we are. This honesty comes at a cost. Meursault's refusal to pretend grief at his mother's funeral leads to his execution. Jean-Baptiste Clemence's recognition of his own hypocrisy destroys his peace of mind. But dishonesty costs more. Living inauthentically means betraying ourselves, becoming strangers to our own experience. The challenge is maintaining authenticity while remaining connected to others. Meursault's honesty isolates him from society, but complete isolation is not the answer either. We are social beings who need connection and community. The task is being honest while maintaining solidarity, refusing false performances while remaining engaged with others. Camus' life illustrates both the possibilities and limits of his philosophy. He lived passionately, embracing physical pleasure, artistic creation, and political engagement. He maintained principles under pressure, refusing to compromise with totalitarianism despite attacks from all sides. He produced significant literary and philosophical work that has endured. But he also struggled with contradictions between his philosophy and his behavior. He preached solidarity while being serially unfaithful to the women who loved him. He advocated honesty while deceiving his wife. He praised loyalty while betraying trust. These failures do not invalidate his ideas, but they remind us that living according to philosophical principles is difficult. Perhaps the contradictions make him more human and his philosophy more realistic. Camus does not claim that living well is easy or that we can achieve moral perfection. He acknowledges that we will fail, that we will hurt people, that we will not always live up to our own standards, but we should still try. The effort matters even when we fall short. For people facing contemporary crises, climate change, political polarization, economic inequality, technological disruption, Camus offers both realism and hope. The realism is that there is no guarantee these problems will be solved, no cosmic force ensuring a happy outcome. We may fail, catastrophe may come, but the hope is that we can still act, that our efforts have value even if ultimate success is not guaranteed. We should fight climate change not because we know we will win, but because fighting is better than surrender. We should oppose injustice not because history guarantees triumph, but because opposition maintains our humanity. We should create and love and work not because these activities have cosmic significance, but because they make our limited time worthwhile. Camus teaches that happiness is possible even in an absurd world. Not the happiness that comes from achieving all goals or seeing all dreams realized. Not the happiness that depends on believing life has transcendent purpose. But the happiness that comes from full engagement with existence, from loving despite loss, from creating despite futility, from pushing our boulder with conscious commitment. This is not easy happiness. It requires accepting hard truths about mortality, meaninglessness, and the indifference of the universe. It requires living without the consolations of religion or ideology. It requires taking full responsibility for our choices without blaming God, history, or fate. But it offers something many people seek, a way to live authentically in the world as it actually is rather than as we wish it to be. The message is simultaneously sobering and liberating. We have less than we might hope. No immortality, no cosmic justice, no guaranteed meaning. But we have more than nihilism suggests. The capacity to create value, the ability to reduce suffering, the possibility of solidarity and love. This limited but real foundation suffices for a life lived well. In the end, Camus invites us to imagine ourselves happy like Sisyphus in the midst of our struggles. Not happy because we have solved all problems or found ultimate answers. Happy because we have accepted our condition and chosen to live fully anyway. Happy because we have said yes to life despite its difficulties, embraced the world despite its indifference, and created meaning where none was guaranteed. This is his message for our time. Live without illusions, but also without despair. Recognize the absurd but remain engaged. Accept mortality but love life. Acknowledge limits but revolt against injustice. Pursue happiness without false hope. These are difficult teachings, demanding much from those who accept them, but they offer a path for living with integrity in an age that desperately needs models of authentic existence.